What if a name written thousands of years ago in ancient texts still echoes in modern conspiracy theories? Baal, an ancient Canaanite deity mentioned repeatedly in the Bible, was once worshipped as a powerful storm and fertility god. But today, his name surfaces in some of the darkest online narratives surrounding elites, secret societies, and even figures like Jeffrey Epstein. Is this just internet mythology spiraling out of control? Or is there a deeper historical misunderstanding fueling these claims? In this video, we separate ancient history from modern conspiracy and uncover who Baal really was. Imagine standing on a mountaintop in ancient Canaan, somewhere around 850 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. The air smells of cedar and dust. Around you, thousands of people have gathered, not to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to call upon another deity entirely. They are calling out to Baal. They are cutting themselves. They are dancing. They are desperate for fire to fall from the sky. And on the other side of that mountaintop stands a solitary prophet named Elijah, calm and certain, who has staked his very life on the belief that his God, Yahweh, is the only real one. This is one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Scripture, and at the center of it stands a figure who haunts the pages of the Bible, from Genesis to the book of Revelation, Baal. But who is Baal really? Is he merely a superstition, a myth, a cautionary tale about primitive religion? Or is there something deeper, darker, and more significant about this ancient deity that demands our attention even today? Why did the prophets of Israel spend so much energy warning people away from Baal? Why did so many Israelites, including kings, priests, and ordinary families, keep turning to this god despite repeated divine warnings? What was it about Baal that was so compelling, so attractive, and so spiritually dangerous? These are the questions we are going to answer today. Over the course of this presentation, we are going to travel through history, archaeology, ancient texts, biblical narrative, and theological reflection to build a complete portrait of one of the most significant false gods in human history. We are going to look at where Baal came from, what his worshippers believed about him, what they did in his name, what the Bible says about him, and why his legacy still matters in the 21st century. This is not a short journey, it is a deep one, and I want to promise you that by the time we are finished, you will understand the ancient world in a way that will transform how you read your Bible, particularly the Old Testament. The story of Israel is, in very large part, the story of Israel's ongoing struggle with Baal. And until we understand Baal, we cannot fully understand Israel, cannot fully understand the prophets, and cannot fully understand the radical claim of biblical monotheism. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with the name itself. The name, what does Baal mean? The word Baal, spelled B-A-A-L, is one of the most straightforward words in the ancient Semitic languages, and yet its very simplicity contains multitudes. In Hebrew and in the related Semitic languages of the ancient Near East, the root word Baal simply means owner, master, husband, or lord. It is a generic term, not unlike the English word lord or the Latin word dominus. In everyday ancient Canaanite life, you might call the owner of a house the Baal of the house. A husband was the Baal of his wife, at least in the possessive legal sense of ownership that characterized ancient Near Eastern marriage. A citizen with property was a Baal, a landowner, a freeholder. This is critically important for our understanding because Baal was never, in the strictest sense, a proper name. It was a title. It was an honorific. And this creates a complexity that runs all the way through biblical and historical literature. When ancient texts refer to Baal, they are sometimes referring to one specific deity, the great storm god of the Canaanite pantheon, and sometimes referring to a whole category of local deities, each of whom bore the title Baal in their own particular territory or city. This is why the Bible speaks of Baal in both singular and plural forms. There is Baal as a specific major god, but there are also the Baals, the plural Baalim in Hebrew, which refers to the many local manifestations of this divine lordship scattered across the landscape of Canaan. Every city had its own patron deity. Every high place, every sacred grove, every local spring or hill might have its own lord, its own Baal. The Baal of Peor was the lord worshipped at the mountain of Peor. The Baal of Berith was the lord who presided over the covenant shrine at Shechem. The Baal of Zebub, or Beelzebub, was the lord worshipped at Ekron, a Philistine city. Each of these was a Baal, a lord of a specific place. But when we speak of Baal with a capital B, when we speak of the Baal who confronted Yahweh repeatedly throughout Israelite history, the Baal whose prophets filled the court of King Ahab, the Baal of Elijah's great contest on Mount Carmel, we are speaking of a specific deity with a specific mythology, a specific set of attributes, and a specific religious tradition that stretched back thousands of years before Israel even existed as a nation. That deity's full identity, in the Canaanite religious tradition, was Baal Hadad, or simply Hadad, the storm god. And to understand him, we need to understand the world in which he was born. Let us also take a moment to discuss the linguistic relatives of the word Baal in the wider Semitic world. In Akkadian, the dominant language of ancient Mesopotamia, the equivalent term is Belu, also meaning Lord. The great Mesopotamian deity Marduk was sometimes called Bel, the Lord, and this title became virtually synonymous with Marduk himself. In Arabic, the same root gives us words related to dominion and authority. In Phoenician and Punic, the languages of the great seafaring civilization that spread Baal worship across the Mediterranean, the word Baal was used extensively in personal names as well as divine titles. Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps to attack Rome, bore a name meaning grace of Baal or mercy of Baal. His father Hamilcar meant servant of Melkart, another Baal figure. These names were not unusual. They were common. Baal was woven into the fabric of personal identity in the ancient Semitic world, just as Yahweh-based names like Elijah, meaning my God is Yahweh, or Isaiah, meaning Yahweh saves, were woven into Israelite identity. The ubiquity of the word Baal as a title is also why we find it used in the Bible in ways that can be theologically confusing at first glance. There are places in the Old Testament, particularly in older texts, where the name Baal appears in the names of Yahweh's faithful servants. Saul named one of his sons Eshbaal, meaning man of Baal. Jonathan had a son named Meribbaal. David's son was named Beliadah, which contains the Baal element. These names do not necessarily indicate that these men or their fathers were worshippers of the Canaanite storm god. In some early periods of Israelite history, Baal, as a general Semitic word for Lord, could apparently be applied even to Yahweh. Yahweh was, after all, the Lord. But as the battle lines hardened between Yahwism and Baalism, as the prophets drew sharper and sharper distinctions between the God of Israel and the gods of Canaan, the word Baal became so thoroughly associated with the enemy deity that faithful editors of the biblical text went back and changed many of these names. Eshbaal became Ishbosheth, man of shame. Meribbaal became Mephibosheth. The word Baal was replaced with Bosheth, the Hebrew word for shame, in a kind of theological editorial that tells us just how seriously Israel came to take the distinction between their God and Baal. This linguistic history alone tells us a great deal. The word Baal moved from a generic honorific to a proper name to, eventually, a term of disgrace, all because of a centuries-long battle for the heart and soul of ancient Israel. The ancient Near East, the world that produced Baal. To truly understand Baal, we must understand the world that gave birth to him. And that world, the ancient Near East of the 2nd and early 1st millennium before Christ, was a world radically different from our own in almost every conceivable way, and yet recognizable in its deepest human longings. The ancient Near East encompasses the geographical region stretching from Egypt in the west to Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, in the east, with the land of Canaan, roughly modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and western Syria, sitting at the crossroads in between. This region was the cradle of civilization as we know it. It was here that humanity first developed writing, first built cities, first created complex legal codes, first organized large-scale agriculture, and first developed the elaborate religious systems that we now study as ancient mythology. The religious world of the ancient Near East was, without exception, polytheistic. It was a world of many gods, and these gods were not abstract philosophical principles. They were personalities, they had stories, they had desires, They competed with one another. They made alliances. They fought wars. They loved and hated and mourned and celebrated. The gods of the ancient Near East were, in many ways, the ancient equivalents of the characters in a great epic drama, superhuman in power, but profoundly human in motivation. And the most powerful of these divine personalities were the forces of nature. This was an agricultural world, a world that depended entirely on the rhythm of rain and drought, flood and harvest, storm and calm. The people who lived in this world did not have the luxury of regarding nature as a background to human activity. Nature was the foreground. Everything depended on it. A good rainy season meant life. A drought meant death. A flood of the great rivers could wipe out a season's crops in an afternoon. The storm was not merely a meteorological phenomenon. It was a manifestation of divine will, divine power, divine personality. In this context, the storm god was almost universally one of the supreme deities of the ancient Near Eastern pantheon. In Mesopotamia, the great storm god was Enlil, whose name literally means Lord of the Wind, the Enlil being a Sumerian construction. Later, in Babylonian religion, Marduk, whose very origins involved mastery of the primordial waters and winds, took on storm god characteristics. Among the Hittites of Anatolia, the storm god Teshub was the king of the gods, sovereign above all. Among the ancient Egyptians, the god Set had storm and chaos associations, and in Canaan, the great storm god was Baal Hadad. The name Hadad itself comes from an ancient Semitic root related to thunder. It is onomatopoetic in origin, like the sound of the crash and roll of thunder across the hills. Hadad was a storm god worshipped throughout the ancient Semitic world, from Arabia to Mesopotamia to the Levant. He appears in the historical records of ancient Ebla, in the tablets of Mari on the Euphrates, in the records of the Hittites, in the annals of Egypt. He was one of the most widespread divine personalities of the ancient world, precisely because the storm is universal. Everywhere in the ancient world, people looked at the thunderstorm and saw divine power. But the most complete and sophisticated portrait of Baal Hadad that we possess comes not from Mesopotamia or Egypt, but from a small city on the coast of what is now northern Syria, a city called Ugarit. And it is to Ugarit that we must now turn our attention, because without Ugarit, we would understand almost nothing about the religious world that shaped so much of the Old Testament. Ugarit, the key that unlocked Baal. In 1929, a French archaeological expedition made one of the most significant discoveries in the history of biblical scholarship. At a site on the Syrian coast called Ras Shamra, meaning fennel head in Arabic, archaeologists began to unearth the remains of an ancient Bronze Age city. They found palaces, temples, libraries, and thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in a cuneiform script unlike any they had seen before. The city was identified as ancient Ugarit, a prosperous merchant city that had flourished from approximately 1400 to 1200 BCE before being suddenly and violently destroyed, probably by the mysterious Sea Peoples, whose migrations contributed to the collapse of Bronze Age civilization across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. The tablets found at Ugarit were written in a previously unknown alphabetic cuneiform language, Ugaritic, that turned out to be a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, Phoenician, and Aramaic. The discovery and decipherment of Ugaritic opened a window onto the religious and literary world of ancient Canaan that scholars had previously only been able to glimpse through the distorted lens of biblical polemic. Suddenly, we did not have to rely solely on what the Bible said about Canaanite religion. We had the Canaanites' own words, their own myths, their own liturgies, written in their own language from the very period when Israel was entering and settling the land of Canaan. What the Ugaritic tablets revealed was a rich, sophisticated, and deeply developed religious tradition centered on a pantheon of gods presided over by the ancient patriarch god El, and enlivened by the dramatic adventures of El's son, the great storm god Baal Hadad. The mythological texts from Ugarit, known collectively as the Baal cycle, constitute the longest and most complete mythological narrative from the ancient Canaanite world. They run to several thousand lines of poetry across multiple tablets, and they tell a story of cosmic conflict, divine politics, death and resurrection, and the establishment of divine kingship that has profound implications for how we read the Hebrew Bible. But before we explore the Baal cycle itself, let us understand the world of Ugarit more fully, because context matters enormously here. Ugarit was a city of perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 inhabitants, small by modern standards but significant in the ancient world, situated on a natural harbor that made it a major port of call for the maritime trade that connected Egypt, Canaan, the Aegean, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. It was a cosmopolitan, multicultural city where people from many different language groups and ethnic backgrounds lived and traded. Its royal court was sophisticated and literate. The city had multiple scribal schools and libraries, and its scribes were trained in several different writing systems simultaneously. The Ugaritic tablets represent only one part of Ugarit's literary output. There are also texts in Akkadian, Hurrian, Sumerian, Cypriot, and other languages reflecting the city's international connections. The religious life of Ugarit was centered on two main temples situated at the highest point of the city, one dedicated to Baal and one dedicated to Dagon, an ancient grain god who appears in the Bible as the patron deity of the Philistines. The physical proximity and equal prominence of these two temples tell us something important. Baal was not the supreme god of the Ugaritic pantheon in terms of hierarchy. That position belonged to El, but Baal was the most active, most dynamic, most immediately relevant deity in the divine drama. He was the storm, the rain, the life-giving power on which the city's agricultural prosperity depended. His temple was prominent, and his cult was evidently rich. The Ugaritic tablets were written by scribes working for the palace and the temples, and they include a wide variety of text types: mythological narratives, ritual texts, offering lists, liturgical prayers, administrative records, correspondence between the king of Ugarit and other rulers, legal documents, and more. For our purposes, the most important texts are the mythological ones, particularly the Baal cycle, because these give us the fullest picture of who Baal was, what he represented, and how his worshippers understood the cosmos he inhabited. One more thing must be noted about Ugarit's significance. The city was destroyed around 1185 BCE, right at the moment when Israel was beginning to emerge as an identifiable people in the land of Canaan. This means that the religious world described in the Ugaritic texts is precisely the religious world that the early Israelites encountered when they settled in Canaan. The theology, mythology, and ritual practice that the Bible so persistently and vehemently condemns is not a vague, ancient, unrecoverable thing. It is documented in exquisite detail in texts that we can read, analyze, and understand. Ugarit has given us the enemy's dossier, so to speak. It has allowed us to understand, with unprecedented clarity, exactly what Yahwism was defining itself against. The Canaanite pantheon, Baal's divine family. To understand Baal, we must understand his family, the divine household in which he existed, and the relationships that defined him. The Canaanite pantheon was not a random collection of divine personalities. It was an ordered, hierarchical society of gods with a clear structure of authority, family relationships, and political dynamics. At the top of this divine family stood El, literally meaning God in Semitic languages, but here the proper name of the chief deity of the Canaanite pantheon. El was ancient, patriarchal, and somewhat remote. He was the father of years, the creator of created things, the Bull El, powerful, wise, and sovereign in the sense of final authority. His epithet, Father of Years, suggests great age and wisdom. He was the primordial deity, the origin point of the divine family. He was depicted as an elderly, bearded king, seated on a throne, presiding over the assembly of the gods, the divine council that governed cosmic affairs. El's consort, his wife, the queen of the gods, was Asherah, also called Atharat. Asherah was the mother goddess par excellence, the lady of the sea, the progenitor of the 70 sons of El who populated the divine council. She was associated with the sea, with fertility, with maternal nurturing, and with the sacred tree, a connection that explains the Asherah poles that the Bible repeatedly condemns as objects of idolatrous worship in Israel. These poles, wooden posts or stylized trees set up next to altars, were representations of or monuments to Asherah, and they appear repeatedly alongside Baal shrines in biblical condemnation. Asherah and Baal were worship partners. In a sense, if you found one, you usually found the other. El and Asherah were the divine parents of the younger generation of gods, including Baal, but Baal's parentage is complicated in the Ugaritic texts. In some places, he appears as a son of El, while in others, he is called the son of Dagon, the grain god. This may reflect the merger of different local traditions, or it may reflect the complex narrative politics of the divine world in which Baal occupied an ambiguous position, not quite the firstborn, not quite the legitimate heir, but the most powerful and vital of the younger gods nonetheless. Baal's full name in the Ugaritic texts is often Baal Hadad, or simply the Prince Lord of the Earth. In Ugaritic, Zbel Baal Ars. He is also called Rider of the Clouds, a title with enormous significance because in the Hebrew Bible, Rider of the Clouds is a title given exclusively to Yahweh. The fact that this specific epithet was originally associated with Baal and then co-opted by or attributed to Yahweh in the Psalms is one of the most theologically interesting points in the entire study of Israelite religion and its relationship to its Canaanite environment. We will return to this point in detail later. Baal's primary consort was the goddess Anat, sometimes called Astarte, though these are technically distinct goddesses with overlapping characteristics. Anat was the goddess of war, hunting, and passionate love. She was Baal's sister in some traditions and his wife or lover in others. She was one of the most ferocious figures in the entire Canaanite pantheon, a divine warrior who waded through battle with such joy that she is described in one Ugaritic text as binding enemy heads to her back and warrior hands to her belt as trophies. She was the one who, in the Baal cycle, would fight on Baal's behalf when he was threatened. She was dangerous, passionate, and utterly devoted to her brother our consort. Then there was the great adversary, Mot, whose name simply means death in Semitic languages. Mot was the ruler of the underworld, the god of death and sterility, the great enemy of life and growth. He was insatiable. Like death itself, he was never satisfied, always demanding more. He was depicted as having an enormous mouth, with lips that reached from earth to heaven and a throat that consumed like a pit. To enter Mot's realm was to descend into the underworld, to be consumed. The conflict between Baal and Mot, between the life-giving rain and the desiccating death of the summer drought, was the central drama of the Baal cycle and the animating myth behind a great deal of Canaanite religious ritual. Another major divine adversary was Yam, the god of the sea and rivers, also associated with chaos and disorder. In the Ugaritic texts, Yam's full title is Prince Sea, Judge River, Zebul Yam, Tepti Nahar. The sea in ancient Near Eastern cosmology was not simply a body of water, it was the primordial chaos, the unordered, threatening force that opposed the ordered cosmos. Yam represented this chaos in divine form, and his conflict with Baal, which opens the Baal cycle, represents the cosmic battle between order and chaos, between the civilized, rain-giving storm god and the threatening, destructive sea. Other significant divine figures include Resheph, the god of plague, Kothar Wakasis, the divine craftsman and artificer, compare with Hephaestus in Greek mythology or Vulcan in Roman, Shapsh, the sun goddess, in Ugaritic mythology, the sun is female, Athtar, a morning star deity associated with Venus, and Lotan, the great sea serpent, the same name that appears in Hebrew as Leviathan, the great monster of the deep that appears in Job, Psalms, and Isaiah. The Ugaritic description of Lotan as a fleeing serpent, a twisting serpent, a powerful beast with 7 heads, is echoed almost verbatim in the biblical descriptions of Leviathan, and later, in the imagery of the dragon in the Book of Revelation. This divine family, El and Asherah presiding over the council of gods, Baal, the vigorous storm god fighting for cosmic order against sea and death. Anat, the fierce divine warrior. Mot, the insatiable death god. Lotan, the sea monster, formed the mythological universe of ancient Canaan. And it is this universe, these stories, these divine personalities that the Bible engages with, contests, and in many cases deliberately parodies or deconstructs in its great narrative of Yahweh's uniqueness and sovereignty. The Baal cycle, the great epic of the storm god. The Baal cycle, also sometimes called the Baal epic or the cycle of Baal, is the longest and most significant mythological text from ancient Ugaritic. It survives across multiple clay tablets, and while significant portions are missing or damaged, a perennial frustration for scholars working with ancient literature, enough has survived to reconstruct the main narrative arc with reasonable confidence. It is written in elevated, formal Ugaritic poetry, parallel half-lines in the tradition of ancient Semitic verse that will be immediately recognizable to anyone who has read biblical poetry, particularly the Psalms. The story of the Baal cycle unfolds in 3 major movements, each corresponding to a fundamental aspect of cosmic reality as the ancient Canaanites understood it. The battle with Yam, the sea chaos, the building of Baal's palace, the establishment of divine kingship, and the battle with Mot, the cycle of death and life. Let us examine each of these movements carefully. The first movement, Baal versus Yam. The cycle begins in what appears to be a situation of divine political crisis. The god Yam, Prince C, has petitioned the senior deity El for recognition as the king of the gods. El, perhaps weakly or perhaps strategically, has granted Yam's request and sent messengers to the divine assembly announcing that Baal must be handed over to Yam as a prisoner or servant. The divine council, gathered around El in his cosmic dwelling at the source of the 2 rivers in the midst of the springs of the double deep, is terrified. When Yam's messengers arrive, described as divine heralds whose very appearance causes the assembled gods to bow down in fear, Baal alone refuses to be intimidated. He stands defiantly, ready to fight. What follows is a cosmic battle between Baal and Yam. Baal is equipped by the divine craftsman Kothar Wakasis with 2 magical weapons, clubs or maces, given the names Yagrush, meaning driver, and Imur, meaning expeller. With these weapons, Baal strikes Yam, first failing, then succeeding on the second blow. Yam collapses. Baal prepares to kill him completely. Anat and Astarte call out to Baal to scatter and destroy Yam, and Yam is defeated. Baal's title, Rider of the Clouds, is confirmed, and his sovereignty over the earth is established. The theological meaning of this myth would have been immediately clear to an ancient Canaanite audience. The sea, Yam, represented the primal, threatening, uncreated chaos that surrounded and threatened the ordered world. The storm, Baal, was the force that controlled, shaped, and ultimately overcame that chaos. When the storm rolled in over the Mediterranean and the lightning cracked and the rain fell in torrents, that was Baal in action. Baal conquering the sea. Baal bringing order and life to the world. The myth sacralizes the very weather patterns that governed life in the Levant, the arrival of the rains after the dry summer, the storm breaking the drought's power. The second movement, Baal's palace. Having defeated Yam and established himself as the champion of cosmic order, Baal now lacks something crucial for a god of his stature, a palace. In ancient Near Eastern thinking, a god without a palace was a god without proper dignity and authority. The divine palace was both the symbol and the source of divine kingship, the place from which a god ruled, the place where the divine assembly gathered, the place that manifested the god's cosmic significance. So Baal petitions El for permission to build a palace. El is initially reluctant. Apparently, there is a complicated divine political situation involving Asherah's mediating role and various gifts that need to be presented to the queen of the gods. Eventually, through Anat's fierce advocacy and proper protocol, the divine craftsman Kothar Wakasis is commissioned to build Baal's palace on Mount Zaphon, the sacred mountain of the north, Baal's cosmic dwelling place. The construction of the palace is described in loving detail. The finest cedar, the finest silver and gold, the work of the divine craftsman. There is a fascinating dispute between Baal and Kothar-Wakasis about whether the palace should include a window. Baal is initially opposed to a window, perhaps fearing that it would give Mot a way in, but eventually agrees, and when the window is opened, it is through this window that the divine voice of the storm, the thunder, goes forth to the earth. Baal sends out his holy voice through the window, and the earth shakes. Baal's palace represents the storm cloud itself, the divine dwelling from which the thunder speaks and the rain descends. Once the palace is complete, Baal throws a great banquet for the gods, celebrates his kingship, and prepares to consolidate his dominion over the earth. He sends messengers through all the lands proclaiming his sovereignty. He is now, in the fullest sense, the cosmic king, at least of the realm of the living earth. But his triumph will not last. The great adversary is still waiting. The third movement, Baal and Mot, death and resurrection. The third and most dramatically significant movement of the Baal cycle begins when Baal makes the fatal mistake of challenging Mot, death, instead of simply maintaining respectful boundaries. In the ancient cosmological vision of the Canaanites, Baal and Mot had a prior agreement. Baal ruled the upper world, the sky, the clouds, the rain-giving storm, and Mot ruled the lower world, the underworld, the realm of the dead. There was supposed to be a division between their domains. But Baal, flush with his victories and his new palace, overreaches. He sends messengers to Mot's realm with what can only be read as a provocative message, essentially announcing his supremacy and expecting Mot to submit. Mot, who is never intimidated and never subservient, sends back a terrifying response. He describes himself in his full cosmic horror, his throat descending to the earth, his lips to the heavens, his tongue touching the stars. He invites Baal, commands Baal, to descend into his realm, and Baal, apparently recognizing that he cannot refuse and cannot escape, agrees to go. He mates with a divine heifer and produces a son, perhaps to ensure an heir, and then descends into the underworld, into the maw of Mot. The earth responds to Baal's death with desolation. The rain stops, the storms cease, the crops wither, the divine sun goddess Shapsh mourns over the dead Baal. Baal's consort Anat searches for him, and when she finds the news of his death confirmed, she weeps with a grief described in one of the most moving passages in all ancient literature. She cuts herself with a flint, gashes her cheeks, plows the ground of her chest. Like a garden she weeps, like a valley she weeps over Baal's death. Then she goes to El and announces the death of the Son of God, the Lord of the earth. In Baal's absence, El allows another deity, Athtar, the morning star, to attempt to sit on Baal's throne. But Athtar is not sufficient for the task. He is described as too small, his feet not reaching the footstool, his head not reaching the back of the throne. He descends and becomes a ruler of the underworld, an inadequate substitute. Then comes the great act of divine revenge and cosmic restoration. Anat confronts Mot. When diplomatic overtures fail, she turns to direct violence. She seizes Mot, cleaves him with a sword, winnows him with a sieve, burns him with fire, grinds him with millstones, and scatters him in the fields to be eaten by birds. It is worth noting that this description, cleaving, winnowing, grinding, is the vocabulary of grain processing, the agricultural operations that transform grain from the stalk into bread. Mot, the god of the dry, barren, death-dealing summer, is destroyed with the instruments of the harvest. This is a profoundly agricultural myth, and with Mot's destruction, or at least his temporary defeat, Baal returns. The divine sun goddess has a dream in which she sees the sky rain oil and the wadis run with honey, and this is the signal of Baal's return to life. Baal is restored to his throne, the rains return, and the cycle of fertility and life begins again. But, and this is crucial for understanding the cyclical nature of the myth, Mot is not permanently destroyed. After 7 years, Mot revives and confronts Baal again. The two divine enemies do battle, and they fight to something like a draw, with the sun goddess Shapsh intervening to warn Mot that El supports Baal's sovereignty. The myth ends, not with a final definitive victory, but with the acknowledgement that the cycle will continue. Baal will reign, Mot will come again, the rains will fall and the drought will return. Life and death will alternate in the eternal rhythm of the agricultural year. This cyclical pattern, Baal's death in the summer drought, his resurrection with the return of the autumn rains, Mot's recurring challenge and Baal's recurring renewal, was not merely a story the Canaanites told. It was a living reality that they believed they participated in and influenced through their rituals. We will discuss those rituals in detail when we turn to Baal worship. But first, let us consider the profound theological implications of this myth and its relationship to the biblical worldview. Baal in the Bible, the recurring enemy. With the Ugaritic texts in hand, we can now read the Bible's many references to Baal with new eyes. What was once opaque becomes transparent. The prophet's polemic against Baal, the priest's warnings against the Baals, the historian's laments about Israel's repeated defection to Baal worship. All of this makes perfect sense when we understand exactly who and what Baal was. The Bible mentions Baal more than 90 times. That is a remarkable frequency. No other pagan deity receives anywhere near this level of attention in the Hebrew Bible. El, Asherah, Moloch, Chemosh, Dagon all appear, but none with the persistent, insistent frequency of Baal. This tells us something important. Baal was not simply one temptation among many for ancient Israel. He was the central, defining alternative to Yahweh in the religious imagination of the ancient Israelite world. Understanding Israel's history means understanding the Baal problem. Let us trace Baal's appearances through the biblical narrative in rough chronological order, beginning with the period of the wilderness wanderings and moving through the monarchy to the prophets. Baal Peor, the first great seduction. The first major encounter with Baal in the biblical narrative takes place not in Canaan, but in the wilderness, just before Israel's entry into the Promised Land. The text is found in Numbers 25, and the incident is referred to again and again throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible as a defining moment of apostasy and divine judgment. Israel has arrived at Shittim on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River, tantalizingly close to the Promised Land, and there, in the shadow of the final stage of their wilderness journey, a crisis erupts. The Israelite men begin to have sexual relations with Moabite women, and the Moabite women invite the Israelite men to the sacrificial meals of their gods, specifically to the sacrifices of their gods. The text says the people ate and bowed down to their gods, and specifically that Israel yoked itself to Baal of Peor. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and a plague broke out that killed 24,000 people. The incident is both sexually and religiously charged, and this combination is not coincidental. As we will discuss in detail when we examine Canaanite ritual, the worship of Baal was deeply intertwined with sexuality and fertility. The ritual enactment of cosmic fertility through human sexuality. The seduction at Baal Peor was not simply a case of Israelite men being distracted by foreign women. It was a systematic entanglement in a religious system that used sexuality as a primary form of worship, and that offered an agricultural fertility deity in place of the transcendent Yahweh who had brought Israel out of Egypt. The name Baal Peor combines the divine title Baal, Lord, with the name Peor, which is both a mountain in Moab and apparently the name of the deity worshipped there. Some scholars have connected the name Peor with the Hebrew root meaning to open wide or to gape, possibly a reference to the topography of the sacred site or to ritual elements associated with the worship. The rabbinical tradition later understood Baal Peor worship to involve particularly obscene rituals, though we cannot independently verify the specific details. What we can say is that Numbers 25 was, for biblical Israel, the paradigmatic apostasy, the example of what happened when Israel allowed itself to be enticed by foreign worship. The episode is echoed in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in Psalms, in Hosea, in numerous other texts. The prophet Hosea, writing centuries later, would use Baal Peor as a touchstone for his devastating critique of Israel's spiritual unfaithfulness. The image of Israel yoking itself to Baal was both agricultural, yoke animals are paired to work together, and sexual, suggesting an intimate union that the text presents as profoundly illicit. Baal in the period of the Judges. As Israel settles in Canaan after the conquest, the Baal problem becomes a recurring refrain in the book of Judges, which has a characteristic cycle. Israel does evil in the eyes of Yahweh by serving the Baals and the Asherahs. Yahweh becomes angry and allows foreign oppression. Israel cries out. Yahweh raises up a deliverer. The land has peace for a generation. The deliverer dies, and Israel reverts to Baal worship. This cycle repeats with variations throughout the entire book of Judges. The summary statement in Judges 2:11-13 is particularly clear. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. Judges 3, 6, 8, 10. Each section returns to this theme. By the time of Gideon, in Judges 6, the Baal problem has become domesticated, literally. Gideon's father, Joash, has a Baal altar and an Asherah pole right in his own household. Yahweh commands Gideon to tear them down and replace the Asherah pole with wood for an offering to Yahweh. When the men of the town discover what has happened, they demand that Gideon's father hand him over to be killed for desecrating the Baal altar. Joash's response is memorable. If Baal is really a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. This sardonic challenge, let Baal fight his own battles, is theologically pointed. It anticipates Elijah's challenge on Mount Carmel by several centuries. The daughter of Jephthah is sacrificed or dedicated to perpetual virginity, as some read the text, in what may be a context of Baal-influenced religious practice. Samson's entanglement with foreign women and foreign religious contexts speaks to the perennial allure of Canaanite culture and its religious system for Israelite men. The book of Judges is, in many ways, the book of what happens to a covenant people when it allows Baal into its national life. The monarchy and the Baal crisis. The most intense and dramatic confrontation between Yahwism and Baalism in the biblical narrative occurs during the period of the divided monarchy, specifically during the reign of King Ahab of Israel, Northern Kingdom, in the 9th century BCE. The story of Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah represents the high water mark of Baal's influence in Israelite national life, and it is told in extraordinary detail across several chapters of 1st and 2nd Kings. Ahab and Jezebel, the royal champions of Baal. Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel around 874 BCE and reigned for approximately 22 years. By the standards of ancient Near Eastern kingship, he was actually a fairly competent monarch politically. His father Omri had established a strong dynasty, built the city of Samaria as his capital, and created a network of international alliances that made Israel a significant regional power. Ahab continued and expanded these alliances. But his most consequential political act, from a biblical perspective, was his marriage to Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Phoenicians. Ethbaal's very name means with Baal, or Baal is with him, which tells us something about the Phoenician royal family's religious orientation. Jezebel herself was apparently a deeply committed devotee of the Phoenician manifestation of Baal, specifically Baal Melkart, the lord of the city, the patron deity of Tyre, one of the great Phoenician maritime cities. The first book of Kings tells us that Ahab not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. This is extraordinary. Ahab built a temple to Baal in Samaria, the capital city. This was not simply tolerating Baal worship as a private religious practice among Canaanite subjects, which had been the practice of earlier kings. This was state religion. This was Baal worship with royal patronage, royal funding, and royal endorsement. And Jezebel was not a passive consort who brought her foreign religious practices along as a private matter. She was an aggressive missionary for her God, funding 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah at royal expense, who eat at Jezebel's table, as the text puts it, and simultaneously conducting a pogrom against Yahweh's prophets, hunting them down and killing them. One of Ahab's court officials, Obadiah, secretly protected 100 prophets of Yahweh by hiding them in 2 caves and supplying them with bread and water at great personal risk. The situation under Ahab and Jezebel was therefore a genuine theological and political crisis of the first order. The official religion of the northern kingdom of Israel was no longer even nominally Yahwism, it had become Baalism. The prophets of Yahweh were in hiding or dead. The prophets of Baal had the ear of the king and the queen, and into this crisis stepped the prophet Elijah. Elijah, the Yahweh's champion. Elijah the Tishbite appears in the biblical narrative in 1 Kings 17 without any genealogical introduction or backstory. He simply appears, announces a drought, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word, and disappears. The drought is, of course, a devastating theological statement. Baal was the storm god. Baal was the rain giver. The whole point of Baal worship was fertility, the assurance of rain and harvest. By withholding rain through Yahweh's prophet, the Bible is dramatizing in the most concrete possible way the contest between the two divine claimants. Who really controls the rain? For 3 years, the drought continues. The land is devastated. Ahab searches desperately for Elijah, apparently blaming him, or blaming Yahweh, for the catastrophe. Meanwhile, Elijah is sustained miraculously. First by ravens bringing him food at the brook of Cherith, then by a miraculous supply of flour and oil that does not run out in the home of a widow in Zarephath. Zarephath, significantly, is in Phoenicia, the very heartland of Baal's most intense worship. That Yahweh sustains his prophet in Baal's own territory, and that he performs miracles there, including the resurrection of the widow's son, is a pointed theological statement. Yahweh is sovereign even in Baal's homeland. Then comes the great confrontation. We will devote an entire segment to it shortly, but first, let us note the deeper theological significance of the 3-year drought as a Baal challenge. The 3-year drought pattern is not arbitrary. In the ancient Canaanite agricultural calendar, based on the mythology of the Baal cycle, the summer drought was the period of Baal's death, his descent into Mot's realm. The autumn rains signaled his resurrection. A typical drought lasted through the summer, with rains returning in autumn. A 3-year drought, spanning multiple cycles of the agricultural year, would have been an absolute catastrophe, a declaration that Baal was not merely absent seasonally, but was completely impotent. The 3 years of drought under Elijah correspond, symbolically, to the fullest possible humiliation of Baal, not just one seasonal absence, but year after year of failed rain, failed crops, failed divine promise. The contest on Mount Carmel, the definitive showdown. We now come to one of the most famous scenes in all of Scripture, a scene that has been depicted in art, drama, literature, and film, a scene that epitomizes the contest between Yahweh and Baal in the most dramatic possible terms, the confrontation on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. Elijah meets Ahab after 3 years. Their exchange is sharp and revealing. Ahab, upon seeing Elijah, says, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Using a Hebrew word that implies bringing calamity or ruin. Elijah's response is the great prophetic turnaround. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." This is the prophet's fundamental theological argument in 3 sentences. The drought is not Elijah's fault or Yahweh's fault. It is the consequence of Israel's own defection. Cause and effect in the theological universe. You abandon Yahweh for Baal, and the rain that Baal supposedly controls stops falling. The very thing Baal promised, rain, fertility, harvest, has been withheld, precisely because Israel chose Baal over the one who actually controls the rain. Elijah then makes his proposal. Gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and they will have a contest. Mount Carmel is a significant choice of location. The Carmel Range, a long ridge running from southeast to northwest, ending in a dramatic promontory that juts into the Mediterranean at the modern city of Haifa, was traditionally associated with the divine, with sacred heights, and apparently with Baal worship. It is as if Elijah is choosing to fight on Baal's home turf, confident that Yahweh will prevail even there. The rules of the contest are simple and elegant. Each side will prepare a bull on wood and pray to their respective deity. The god who answers by fire, who lights the sacrifice, wins. The people assembled agree to the terms. Elijah, with characteristic theatrical awareness, gives the prophets of Baal first choice. They can choose their bull and go first. The narrative of the prophets of Baal's effort is one of the most darkly comic passages in the entire Bible, written with a kind of savage irony that only someone absolutely certain of the outcome could afford. They prepare their bull, they call on Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, and nothing happens. Not a sound, not a voice, not a response. Then they dance around the altar, a ritual dance, presumably one of their liturgical responses to divine silence, an attempt to attract the deity's attention through dramatic supplication, still nothing. And then Elijah begins to mock them. The Hebrew of his taunting is particularly rich. Shout louder, he says. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. The word translated busy in some versions is actually a Hebrew euphemism for relieving oneself. Elijah may be suggesting, with breathtaking impudence, that Baal is in the bathroom and cannot be bothered. The word translated traveling may indicate that the deity has gone on a journey and is absent, and the suggestion that he is sleeping resonates with the entire mythology of Baal's death-sleep cycle. Yes, perhaps Baal is in the underworld. Perhaps Baal is in Mot's realm. Perhaps Baal is dead. If so, pray louder. Maybe it will help. The prophets of Baal respond to this taunting by escalating their rituals. They shout louder and, the text says, they cut themselves with swords and spears, according to their custom, until their blood flowed. This practice of ritual self-cutting or self-wounding is attested in other ancient sources as a form of supplication or mourning associated with Baal's death cult. The devotees enacting their grief at Baal's absence, demonstrating their desperation, perhaps hoping to move the deity to respond through the spectacle of their suffering. They continued this frantic prophesying. The word might better be translated raving, a kind of ecstatic religious frenzy, until the time of the evening sacrifice. And still, there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah steps forward. First, he repairs the altar of Yahweh that had been broken down. 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, a deliberate act of covenantal symbolism. He digs a trench around the altar. He arranges the wood, cuts the bull in pieces, and lays it on the wood. Then he does something audaciously unnecessary. He has the people pour 4 large jars of water over the sacrifice. Not once, 3 times. 12 jars of water, making absolutely certain that no one can accuse Yahweh's fire of having a head start from smoldering embers or a spark. The trench fills with water. Everything is thoroughly, demonstrably soaking wet. Then Elijah prays. The contrast with the 4 hours of Baal's prophets' frantic activity is total. One man, one simple prayer. Not a liturgical dance, not self-mutilation, not hours of shouting. Just prayer. He calls on the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, establishing the covenantal connection, and asks that Yahweh answer so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And the fire falls. The fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Everything consumed. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water in the trench. This is not simply fire. This is divine fire that consumes things ordinary fire cannot touch, including water. The theological statement is unmistakable. Here is the deity who truly controls the elements. Here is the one who makes rain, but who can also, when he chooses, consume water. The people's response is immediate and total. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The Hebrew is powerful. Ha Yahweh hu ha Elohim, the very formulation of exclusive monotheistic confession. Yahweh, the covenant name, is the God, the Elohim, the designation for the divine in general. They are not simply choosing Yahweh as one God among many. They are declaring that Yahweh is God, full stop. Elijah then commands the people to seize the prophets of Baal. They are seized, brought down to the Kishon Valley, and executed, all 450 of them. This act of violence troubles modern readers, and it should prompt reflection. But in the context of the ancient world, it is consistent with the theological logic of the narrative. If the contest has definitively established that Baal is false and Yahweh is true, then the prophets who have been leading Israel into this cosmic error, and who, under Jezebel's regime, have been actively killing Yahweh's prophets, face the penalty for prophesying falsely in the name of a false god. The story does not end with the fire, it ends with rain. Elijah goes to the top of Carmel, crouches down, and sends his servant to look toward the sea 7 times. 6 times, nothing. The 7th time, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea, and Elijah sends word to Ahab immediately, "Get your chariot ready and go before the rain stops you." The sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling. The drought is over, the rain is back. Baal's great promise, rain, fertility, life, has been fulfilled not by Baal, but by the God who defeated Baal's prophets. The theological architecture of this narrative is exquisite. The drought challenged Baal on his own terms. The contest challenged his reality. The execution eliminated his prophetic infrastructure, and the rain, coming immediately after Yahweh's vindication, confirms what the drought had implied. The rain was never Baal's to give. Baal worship, practices and rituals. We have examined the mythology of Baal extensively. Now let us turn to the lived reality of Baal worship, what it actually looked like on the ground, in the communities that practiced it, in the daily lives of ordinary people. This is important because one of the key questions we need to answer is why Baal worship was so attractive, so persistent, so difficult for the prophets to eradicate. Understanding the practice helps us understand the appeal. Sacred sites, high places and temples. Baal worship was concentrated at specific sacred sites, of which the most common were the high places, the bamot in Hebrew, the plural of bama. These were elevated locations, hilltops, ridges, mountain summits, that served as outdoor sanctuaries. The choice of elevated locations for divine worship was universal in the ancient Near East. Mountains were closer to the sky, closer to the divine realm, and they offered an unobstructed view of the heavens that was essential for astronomical observation and storm watching. For a storm god like Baal, the high place on a mountain was the natural place of encounter. When the storm rolled in, you could see it from the hilltop. You could feel the wind and smell the rain. You could watch the lightning and hear the thunder. The high place was, in a sense, the place where heaven and earth touched. High places typically included several elements: an altar, often stone, sometimes elevated, for offering sacrifices, a masabah, a standing stone or pillar that served as a symbol of the deity or as a memorial marker, and Asherah, a wooden pole or stylized tree representing the goddess Asherah, and sometimes a sacred building or structure serving as a shrine or temple. The combination of the masabah, masculine, phallic, and the Asherah, feminine, associated with the tree of life and fertility, at the same sacred site encodes the basic fertility theology of Baal religion. The divine masculine and divine feminine forces together generate the life of the earth. The Bible repeatedly condemns these high places. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. 2 Kings 17:10. This description suggests that the high places were ubiquitous in ancient Israel, not rare deviant practices, but everyday religious reality for the majority of the population. The prophet's condemnations of the high places are not academic criticism of a marginal practice, but a frontal assault on the dominant popular religion of the land. In addition to the rural high places, major centers of Baal worship included urban temples. We know from the Ugaritic evidence that Baal had a major temple at Ugarit. The Bible tells us that Ahab built a temple to Baal in Samaria. Archaeological evidence from various sites in Israel and Judah, including Arad, Megiddo, Dan, and Beersheba, has revealed temple complexes and altars that show signs of non-Yahwistic or syncretic religious practice. The sheer physical infrastructure of Baal worship, the temples, the altars, the sacred poles, the standing stones, was woven into the landscape of the ancient Near East in a way that made it practically impossible to avoid. The sacrificial system. At the heart of Baal worship, as with virtually all ancient Near Eastern religion, was sacrifice. Animals were offered at the altar: bulls, sheep, goats, birds. Food and drink offerings accompanied animal sacrifice. The sacrifices served multiple purposes. They fed the deity, they expressed gratitude, they petitioned for blessings, they sealed covenants, they marked the agricultural calendar. The word sacrifice in the ancient world did not primarily mean giving up something painful. It meant establishing a relationship with the divine through the ritual gift of precious food. The Ugaritic texts provide us with extensive sacrificial lists, records of which animals were offered to which deities on which occasions. Baal regularly received bulls, the bull being his symbol, the creature whose bellowing recalled the sound of thunder, whose strength symbolized divine power. The phrase Baal of the heavens was connected to the bull both as symbol and as sacrificial animal. When a worshiper offered a bull to Baal, they were offering the deity's own symbolic self, completing the circle of divine power. There are also references in the Ugaritic texts and in the biblical record to the sacrificial meal, the communal feast that followed the sacrifice, in which worshippers shared in the meat that had been offered. This is significant because it means that Baal worship was, among other things, a community experience. People gathered, ate together, drank wine together, participated in a shared ritual meal that bound the community together and connected them to the divine. The social dimension of Baal worship should not be underestimated. It was not merely a private spiritual transaction. It was a public, communal, festive occasion. This community dimension was part of its appeal and part of why it was so difficult to eliminate. The agricultural calendar and seasonal festivals. Baal's mythology was, at its core, the mythological expression of the agricultural calendar. The Baal cycle's narrative of death and resurrection mapped directly onto the annual rhythm of farming in the Levant. The death of Baal in the dry summer, his resurrection with the autumn rains, the growing season, the harvest, the return of summer drought. Baal worship was therefore organized around the agricultural year in a fundamental way. The great seasonal festivals of Baal worship corresponded to the major transitions of the farming calendar: the beginning of the rainy season in autumn, the planting season, the harvest festivals in spring and early summer, and the height of the dry season in midsummer. At each of these transitions, rituals were performed to assist or align with the cosmic drama being enacted in the divine realm. When Baal descended to Mot in the summer, worshippers might enact mourning rituals, lamentations, ritual weeping, perhaps the self-cutting described in the Elijah narrative. When Baal returned with the autumn rains, there would be celebration and thanksgiving. The parallels and overlaps with the Israelite agricultural festival calendar: Sukkot, the festival of booths, in autumn; Pesach, Passover, in spring; Shavuot, the festival of weeks, at the grain harvest, are obvious, and they reflect the simple fact that both religious systems were responding to the same underlying agricultural reality. The key difference was theological. For Baalism, the agricultural calendar was the story of Baal's death and resurrection, with ritual participation that could influence the cosmic drama. For Yahwism, the agricultural festivals were remembrances of Yahweh's historical acts of salvation. Passover commemorated the Exodus, Sukkot commemorated the wilderness journey, with an overlying story of a God who acted in history, not merely in nature. Sacred prostitution. The contested question. No discussion of Baal worship is complete without addressing what is perhaps its most notorious alleged feature: sacred prostitution. The Bible mentions Kadeshim and Kadeshat, male and female persons with a title related to the Hebrew word kadosh, meaning holy or set apart, in connection with pagan worship practices that are apparently sexual in nature. 1 Kings 14:24 mentions male shrine prostitutes, Kadeshim, in the land. Deuteronomy 23:17-18 prohibits Israelite men and women from becoming a Kadesha or Kadesh, and links the earnings of a zona, harlot or prostitute, and the price of a dog, apparently a male prostitute or cult functionary, as unacceptable for offerings at Yahweh's temple. The traditional interpretation of these texts is that Canaanite and Baal religion included the institutionalized practice of sacred or cultic prostitution, sexual intercourse performed in a religious context, either in the temple or at the sacred site, as a form of worship or as a ritual enactment of the divine fertility that Baal and Asherah represented. The logic would be, if Baal's gift to the earth is fertility and abundance, then ritual sexual activity at the sacred site would be a participation in that fertility, a kind of sympathetic magic that encouraged the divine fertility to manifest in the fields and flocks. This interpretation was dominant in biblical scholarship from the 19th century through most of the 20th century. However, in recent decades, some scholars have questioned whether sacred prostitution, as a formal institution, actually existed in the ancient Near East. They point out that the Ugaritic texts, our best source for Canaanite religion, do not explicitly describe institutionalized cultic prostitution. They note that the translation of Kadesha as cult prostitute may be inaccurate. The root meaning of kadosh is holy or dedicated, not sexual. A Kadesha might be a woman dedicated to the temple service in some non-sexual role. This is a genuine scholarly debate, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it. What we can say with confidence is, the biblical text clearly associates pagan worship, and specifically Baal and Asherah worship, with sexual activity that crosses Yahweh's covenantal boundaries. Whether this was formalized sacred prostitution as an institution, or a more diffuse pattern of sexual license associated with the festive atmosphere of pagan religious gatherings, or both, the association between Baal worship and sexual activity is persistent and significant in the biblical record. The prophet Hosea makes this connection central to his entire theological vision. Hosea 4:14 says, "The men consort with harlots and sacrifice with shrine prostitutes." Hosea's central metaphor for Israel's relationship with Baal is that of a faithless wife who plays the harlot with other lovers while her husband, Yahweh, remains faithful. This metaphor would have had limited resonance if there were not actually sexual dimensions to the Baal worship being critiqued. The prophets of Baal, professional religious functionaries, the 450 prophets of Baal mentioned in the Elijah narrative, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table were professional religious functionaries, a class of temple personnel whose role was to seek divine communication, perform rituals, maintain the sacred sites, and provide religious services to the community. The term translated prophet in this context may be somewhat misleading to modern readers who associate prophecy primarily with verbal prediction. In the ancient Near East, a wider range of religious functionaries were involved in divination, ritual performance, mediation between humans and the divine, ecstatic religious experience, and community religious leadership. The frantic prophesying of Baal's prophets at Mount Carmel, the shouting, the dancing, the self-cutting, the frenzy, is consistent with ancient Near Eastern records of ecstatic religious behavior. We have records from the ancient city of Mari on the Euphrates River, 18th century BCE, of prophets called ecstatics or frenzied ones, who received divine messages in states of altered consciousness, sometimes after self-induced ecstasy. The prophets of Baal appear to have been specialists in this kind of religious ecstasy, using physical means, dance, self-wounding, rhythmic repetition, to enter states in which they could act as conduits for divine communication or intercession. The fact that Jezebel funded 850 such prophets at royal expense tells us something about the scale of Baal worship's institutional presence in Israel during the Omri-Ahab dynasty. This was not a fringe practice sustained by a few devoted believers. It was a state-sponsored religious institution with a substantial professional clergy. Baal worship in Israel and Judah, a deeper survey. The Elijah narrative, dramatic as it is, represents only one episode in a much longer and more complex history of Baal worship in Israel and Judah. To fully understand the extent and significance of Baal's presence in Israelite religious life, we need to survey that history more broadly, tracing the evidence through the books of Kings, the prophets, and the archaeological record. The Northern Kingdom, Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel, which existed from the division of Solomon's kingdom around 930 BCE until its destruction by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, had a particularly fraught relationship with Baal worship. From its very founding, the northern kingdom's religious identity was shaped by the political decision of Jeroboam I, the first king of the northern breakaway state, to establish a rival religious system that would prevent his citizens from going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Jeroboam set up 2 golden calves, one at Bethel and one at Dan, with the announcement, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This act is condemned vehemently in the biblical text, and it established what the Deuteronomistic historians called the sin of Jeroboam, the besetting theological problem of the northern kingdom. Whether the golden calves were intended as representations of Yahweh, the bull being an ancient symbol of divine power, or as direct adoption of Baal symbolism, the bull being Baal's primary animal, is debated by scholars. The text presents them as straightforward apostasy. What is clear is that they set a precedent for religious syncretism in the north that made the subsequent Baal crisis under Ahab easier to achieve. The Omride dynasty, Omri and his son Ahab, followed by Ahaziah and Joram, represents the peak of Baal's institutional presence in the northern kingdom. We have already discussed Ahab and Jezebel at length. It is worth noting that the dynasty's political success, the Assyrian records still call Israel the House of Omri long after the Omride dynasty had ended. Such was its regional significance, made its religious choices influential. A successful, wealthy, internationally connected dynasty gave Baal worship prestige and resources. After the Omride dynasty was overthrown by Jehu in a bloody coup around 841 BCE, Baal worship in the official sense was temporarily curtailed. 2 Kings 10 describes Jehu's destruction of the temple of Baal in Samaria. He called a great assembly of all Baal's servants, prophets, and priests, supposedly for a great sacrifice to Baal. Then, once they were all gathered in Baal's temple, he had his men kill them all and then demolished the temple. They demolished the sacred stone of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal, and people have used it for a latrine to this day. The converted latrine is a particularly pointed piece of biblical irony. But even Jehu, despite this dramatic action, did not institute a thoroughgoing Yahwism. However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. And the northern kingdom continued to struggle with Baal-related practices for the remainder of its existence. The prophet Hosea, writing to the north in the 8th century, describes a society saturated with Baal worship. The people call Yahweh my Baal, using the Canaanite title, instead of my husband, using the Hebrew idiom that Hosea prefers. They burn offerings to the Baals. They forgot Yahweh and went after her lovers, the Baals, who were supposed to give grain, wine, oil, silver, and gold. Hosea's devastating critique suggests that Baal worship was not a minority practice in 8th century Israel. It was the dominant religious mode of most of the population. The southern kingdom, Judah. The southern kingdom of Judah had a different relationship with Baal worship than the north, primarily because the Jerusalem temple provided an institutional center and an alternative to the high places, and because Judah had a higher proportion of kings who attempted reform. But even Judah was far from immune. The reign of Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, who seized power in Judah after her son's death, brought Baal worship into the Davidic capital itself. 2 Chronicles 24:7 mentions that Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the temple of God and had even used its sacred objects for the Baals. A temple of Baal was established in Jerusalem. The Yahwistic priest Jehoiada eventually led a coup that overthrew Athaliah, killed the priest of Baal, a man named Matan, before the very altars of Baal, and restored Yahwistic worship. The long and complex reign of Manasseh, the son of the reforming King Hezekiah, and probably the most vilified king in Judah's history from the biblical perspective, brought a comprehensive restoration of Baal worship to Judah. 2 Kings 21 describes Manasseh's religious program in detail. He rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah had destroyed, erected altars to Baal, and made an Asherah pole, worshipped all the starry hosts, built pagan altars in the courts of Yahweh's temple, and sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. Manasseh's reign lasted 55 years, the longest of any king in the biblical record, and his religious influence was so deep that the Deuteronomistic historian attributes the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem to it. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh. The reforming King Josiah, in the late 7th century, undertook the most comprehensive reform in Judah's history, destroying the high places, breaking down the Asherah poles, removing the horses dedicated to the sun god from the entrance to Yahweh's temple, desecrating Topheth, the place of child sacrifice in the valley of Ben Hinnom, removing the idolatrous priests who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. The scale of Josiah's demolition project tells us indirectly the scale of the syncretistic religious apparatus that had accumulated in Judah over the centuries. It was massive, it was institutionalized, and it reached right into the temple precinct itself. What archaeology tells us. The archaeological evidence for Baal worship in ancient Israel is both abundant and nuanced. Let me highlight some of the most significant finds. At Kuntilet Ajrud, a remote site in the Sinai Desert, probably a way station or shrine on the trade route from Judah to Elath, archaeologists found 8th century BCE inscriptions that refer to Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. These inscriptions, written in Hebrew in the biblical period, suggest that at least some Israelites understood Yahweh as having an Asherah, a divine consort. This is theologically explosive material. It suggests that popular Israelite religion in the 8th century was significantly more syncretic than the biblical text presents, that ordinary Israelites may have worshipped Yahweh not as the lone, incomparable God of the prophets, but as part of a divine couple, precisely the kind of divine pairing that characterized Baal Asherah religion. The inscriptions at Kuntilet Ajrud are accompanied by Pythos drawings on large storage jars that depict various figures, including what appear to be bovine-headed beings, possibly Baal figures, a figure that may be Asherah seated on a lion throne, and a lyre player. The combination of text and image suggests a popular religious world in 8th century Israel, where Yahweh, Asherah, and possibly Baal coexisted in an easy, perhaps unconscious syncretism. At Megiddo, a major Canaanite and later Israelite city in the Jezreel Valley, archaeologists have found cult stands, animal figurines, and other religious objects spanning from the Canaanite Bronze Age through the Israelite Iron Age, showing the continuity of cultic practice at sacred sites that predated the Israelite settlement. The high place at Megiddo from the early Bronze Age is one of the largest and most elaborate cultic complexes known from that period. The widespread distribution of ceramic female figurines, hand-molded pillar figurines with exaggerated breasts, found by the hundreds across Iron Age Israelite sites, suggests that goddess worship, probably Asherah or a related fertility goddess, was extremely common in ordinary Israelite households of the period. These are not temple objects, they are household objects, found in domestic contexts, suggesting that the fertility goddess was part of everyday popular religion in ancient Israel, regardless of what the official Yahwistic theology proclaimed. The bull figurine from the northern Samaria Hill Country site, sometimes called the Bull Site, an open-air sanctuary on a hilltop dating to the early Iron Age, is a single bronze bull figurine, about 7 inches long, of high-quality craftsmanship. Was it a representation of Baal, of El, of Yahweh under the bull symbol, of the golden calves of Jeroboam? The answer may be impossible to determine definitively, but its presence at an Iron Age sacred site in the territory of early Israel tells us that the bull, Baal's primary symbol, the animal of the storm god, was present in early Israelite religious practice in one form or another. The prophet's case against Baal. If we want to understand why Baal was such a profound problem for biblical religion, we need to listen carefully to what the prophets said about him. The prophetic literature of the Old Testament, from Elijah in the 9th century through Malachi in the 5th century, constitutes a sustained, multifaceted critique of Baal worship and everything associated with it. Each prophet brings a somewhat different emphasis, but together they build a comprehensive theological case against Baal that remains one of the most powerful pieces of religious polemic ever written. Elijah's confrontational approach. Elijah's approach to the Baal problem was direct, confrontational, and uncompromising. He demanded a choice. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. This binary framing, choose one or the other, you cannot serve both, was itself a radical theological statement in a world where polytheism and religious syncretism were the default assumption. Elijah insisted on what modern theologians call exclusive monotheism. There is one God, and allegiance to that God is exclusive and total. Any mixing of Yahweh worship with Baal worship is not a generous theological pluralism. It is a fundamental betrayal of the covenant relationship. Elijah's physical confrontation with the prophets of Baal, his decisive prayer, and his execution of the defeated prophets were all expressions of this uncompromising position. The Baal crisis, in Elijah's view, was not primarily about theological disagreement. It was about cosmic reality. Either Yahweh is real and Baal is not, or Baal is real and Yahweh is not. The contest was designed to establish which was the case, definitively, empirically, undeniably. Hosea's marriage metaphor. The prophet Hosea, writing to the northern kingdom in the mid to late 8th century BCE, took a completely different approach. Where Elijah confronted, Hosea lamented. Where Elijah performed miracles, Hosea enacted parables with his own life. Hosea is commanded by God to marry a woman who proves unfaithful, Gomer, and to keep loving her despite her repeated infidelities. The marriage becomes a living parable of Yahweh's relationship with Israel. Israel as the unfaithful wife, repeatedly abandoning her covenant husband Yahweh to go after other lovers, the Baals. Hosea's theology of Baal worship is deeply intimate and relational. He describes Israel as a wife who gives her wages, the grain, wine, oil, silver, and gold that Yahweh had actually provided, as offerings to the Baals, attributing to them what her true husband had given. He speaks of Israel crying out, "Baal, my Lord, my husband," in familiar intimacy that should be reserved for Yahweh. He uses the most intimate language of marriage, love, faithfulness, knowledge in the biblical sense of intimate relationship to describe what Yahweh wants with Israel and what Baal worship has stolen. Hosea also brilliantly deconstructs Baal's agricultural claim. You think Baal gives you the grain, the wine, the oil? Wrong. Yahweh is the one who provides them. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. The theological move here is crucial. Hosea is not denying that rain falls and crops grow. He is asserting that the real source behind those natural processes is Yahweh, not Baal. The rain falls because Yahweh wills it, not because Baal supplies it. Baal's entire religious appeal, his claim to be the source of agricultural fertility, is false advertising, a claim to credit that belongs to someone else. Hosea's vision of restoration is equally intimate and moving. He sees a day when Israel will call Yahweh my husband, Ishi, instead of my Baal, Baali, a shift from the language of Canaanite divine titles back to the language of covenant intimacy. In that day, Yahweh says, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. Jeremiah's anguished polemic. Jeremiah, writing in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, the period just before and during the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, brings yet another dimension to the prophetic critique of Baal. His condemnations of Baal worship are particularly vivid and anguished, reflecting a man who is watching his people rush toward catastrophe with eyes wide open. In Jeremiah 2, Yahweh speaks through the prophet with devastating rhetorical force. Has any nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror. The cosmic astonishment expressed here, even the heavens are shocked by what Israel has done, underlines the theological absurdity of the exchange. They have traded the real for the fake, the living for the dead, the glorious for the worthless. Jeremiah 7 describes worshippers going to the temple of Yahweh and then committing idolatry, then returning to the temple as if it were a den of robbers, providing them cover. He speaks of burning incense to Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom, of building the high places of Tophet to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. Something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. He warns repeatedly that the Baal burning, the Baal worshipping, the Baal invoking has doomed Jerusalem to destruction. In Jeremiah 19, the prophet takes a clay jar to the valley of Ben Hinnom and, in front of witnesses, smashes it, a prophetic sign act declaring that Yahweh will smash this nation and this city just as this potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. The reason given is explicitly the Baal worship and the child sacrifice. They have built the high places of Baal to burn their children in the fire as offerings to Baal, something I did not command or mention, nor did it enter my mind. In Jeremiah 23, the prophet attacks the false prophets who prophesy by Baal and lead my people Israel astray, professional religious functionaries who invoke Baal rather than Yahweh. He condemns the entire prophetic class of his day for their spiritual adultery and their complicity in the Baal-worshipping culture. The theology of the Baals, according to the prophets. Taking all the prophetic material together, we can extract a systematic theological critique of Baal worship that goes beyond simple condemnation to engage the actual theological claims of Baalism. First, Baal is not the source of agricultural fertility. Yahweh is. The rain falls, the crops grow, the livestock reproduce because Yahweh wills it. Baal's claim to be the rain giver is false. This is the foundational prophetic deconstruction of Baal's entire religious appeal. Second, Baal worship is a fundamental betrayal of the covenant relationship. Israel is in a covenant with Yahweh, a relationship analogous to marriage or parent-child relationship, characterized by loyalty, love, and exclusive commitment. Baal worship violates this covenant at the deepest level. It is not merely incorrect religion, it is faithlessness, adultery, abandonment of the most important relationship in existence. Third, Baal worship is inherently dehumanizing. The rituals associated with it, the sexual license, the self-mutilation, the child sacrifice, degrade and harm human beings. Yahweh's commandments, by contrast, protect human dignity and promote human flourishing. The prophets see Baal worship not merely as theological error, but as a humanistic catastrophe. Fourth, Baal's power is illusory. He cannot defend himself when his altar is torn down, Gideon's father's challenge. He cannot produce fire when challenged, Carmel. He cannot produce rain when his prophets pray desperately. He is, ultimately, nothing. No God, in the language of Deutero-Isaiah, who will develop the most comprehensive polemic against idolatry in the entire biblical corpus. Fifth, and most profound, the worship of Baal is a kind of cosmic ingratitude. Yahweh gave Israel everything: the land, the rain, the harvest, the livestock, the freedom from Egypt. Israel responded by attributing all these gifts to Baal. This is not just theological error, it is the most fundamental form of injustice, claiming that someone other than the actual giver gave the gift. Baal and child sacrifice, the darkest dimension. No discussion of Baal worship is complete, and no discussion can claim to tell the full truth without confronting the most disturbing aspect of Canaanite religion, the practice of child sacrifice. This is the most controversial, most debated, and most morally significant dimension of the religion that the prophets condemned, and it demands careful, honest treatment. The Bible repeatedly connects Baal worship with the sacrifice of children. Jeremiah, as we have seen, condemns the burning of children in the fire to Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom. 2 Kings 17:17 says that the Israelites who were sent into exile by Assyria had sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire as one of their great sins. 2 Kings 23 describes Josiah defiling Topheth, the site of child sacrifice, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. Leviticus 18:21 commands, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God." The identity of Molech, or Moloch, is itself complex and debated. Some scholars believe Molech was a specific deity distinct from Baal. Others have argued that Molech is actually the word Melech, king, combined with the vowels of the word Bosheth, shame. That is, the biblical editors deliberately distorted the name of this deity, whoever he was, by substituting the vowels of shame to make his name into an insult. Still others believe that Moloch may be related to the Phoenician Punic word mulk, which referred to a type of sacrifice, so that to Moloch really means as a mulk sacrifice rather than to the deity Molech. But whatever the precise theological taxonomy of the deity or ritual involved, the practice itself, the killing of children as a form of religious offering, is attested not only in the biblical text, but in external sources as well. The most significant external evidence comes from Carthage, the great North African city founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre. At Carthage, archaeologists have excavated what ancient writers called the Tophet, a sacred precinct containing large numbers of urns filled with the cremated remains of infants and young children. The Tophet of Carthage provides dramatic physical evidence that child sacrifice was practiced in the Phoenician religious tradition. And Phoenicia, of course, was the religious heartland of Baal Melkart, the Baal who had such strong influence in Israel through Jezebel. The connection between Baal worship and child sacrifice in the prophetic tradition raises profound theological questions. Why would child sacrifice be associated with a fertility deity? The paradox seems stark. How can the God of life-giving rain also demand the death of children? Several explanations have been offered by scholars. One theory is that child sacrifice in a crisis context represented the ultimate offering, the most precious thing a worshiper possessed, offered to the deity in a moment of desperate need. If the crops were failing, if the city was under siege, if catastrophe loomed, you might offer what was most valuable, your firstborn child. This would be analogous to the logic of the most costly possible sacrifice. Another theory focuses on the first fruits concept that was part of ancient agricultural religion. Just as the first and best of the harvest was offered to the deity, so the firstborn child might represent the human first fruits, the first and most precious human product offered back to the god of fertility who had given the blessing of offspring in the first place. A third theory, developed by some scholars, suggests that in some contexts, child sacrifice may have been connected to the mythology of Baal's own death and the cosmic sacrifice that maintained the world's order, a kind of participation in the divine drama of death and renewal. None of these explanations make child sacrifice acceptable or excusable. They simply help us understand the internal logic of a practice that strikes modern observers as obviously monstrous. And the prophets of Israel, to their credit, found it monstrous too. They condemned it in the strongest possible terms. When Jeremiah says that child sacrifice never entered God's mind, he is making a fundamental theological claim about the character of the God of Israel. Unlike Baal, Yahweh does not want your children's blood. This is a God who provides a ram to replace Isaac on the altar, a God who substitutes, who redeems, who does not ultimately demand the death of children. The Tophet at Jerusalem, Ben Hinnom. The valley of Ben Hinnom, just southwest of Jerusalem, was, according to Jeremiah and the historical books, the site where Israelite child sacrifice to Baal or Molech was practiced. Josiah defiled it specifically to prevent further child sacrifice there. This valley became so associated with fire and horror that its name, Gehinnom in Hebrew, was eventually transformed into the Greek Gehenna, which became the biblical term for hell. Hell, in the New Testament's vocabulary, is named after the place where Baal's children were burned. That etymological history is profoundly significant. The ultimate symbol of final destruction and divine judgment in Christian theology takes its name from the site of Baal's most horrifying worship. The Topheth, from a Hebrew word possibly meaning fireplace or hearth, was the specific installation within the valley of Ben Hinnom where children were burned. Jeremiah describes building it up and burning sons and daughters there as something utterly contrary to Yahweh's will. Archaeological work in the Jerusalem area has not yet definitively identified a Topheth installation, but the convergence of the textual evidence from Jeremiah, Kings, and Chronicles, combined with the archaeological evidence from Carthage, gives us good reason to accept that such practices occurred. Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. Among the various Baal manifestations mentioned in the Bible, one has had a particularly dramatic cultural legacy. Beelzebub, the Baal worshipped at Ekron, a Philistine city. The name appears in 2 Kings 1 in the story of King Ahaziah of Israel. the son of Ahab and Jezebel, who falls through a lattice and is injured. He sends messengers to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether he will recover from this injury. The prophet Elijah intercepts the messengers with a fierce rebuke from Yahweh. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to consult Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. The name Beelzebub is typically translated Lord of the Flies, Zebub being the Hebrew word for fly. This is an odd title for a deity, and it has generated considerable scholarly discussion. Some scholars believe that Beelzebub is itself a deliberate Hebrew mockery, a contemptuous distortion of the deity's actual name. The real name, they suggest, may have been Baal-zebul, Lord of the Exalted Dwelling, or Lord Prince, with Zebul being an honorific title. The biblical text replaced Zebul with Zebub, flies, as a theological insult, reducing the mighty Lord to a lord of flies. This is consistent with the biblical editorial practice of replacing divine names with terms of disgrace. If the original name was indeed Baal-zebul, Lord Prince, then the New Testament name Beelzebul or Beelzebub preserves both versions of the name. In the New Testament, Beelzebub or Beelzebul appears as a name for the ruler of demons, the prince of evil spirits, effectively Satan's alternative title. When the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, Matthew 12:24, Mark 3:22, Luke 11:15, they are using this name for the chief demonic power. Jesus does not dispute the reality of Beelzebul's existence. He simply denies that he is in league with him. The transformation of Beelzebub from a local Philistine deity consulted for healing oracles into the New Testament's Prince of Demons is a fascinating example of how ancient divine names and concepts evolve and transform over centuries. Baal, who was never simply a devil in Canaanite religion, he was the storm god, the champion against chaos, the life-giving rain, had become, in Jewish and Christian theological reckoning, a demonic power, the very archetype of the false god turned satanic adversary. Baal in Phoenician culture and beyond. While the biblical narrative focuses primarily on Baal's challenge to Yahwistic Israel, Baal's sphere of influence extended far beyond the borders of ancient Canaan. The Phoenicians, the great maritime trading people who inhabited the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon, including Tyre and Sidon, carried Baal worship with them as they established trading colonies throughout the Mediterranean world. Understanding this wider Phoenician world is important for grasping the true scope of Baal's religious empire. The Phoenicians and Baal Melkart. The Phoenicians worshipped Baal in many local manifestations, but the most important and influential was Baal Melkart, Lord of the City, the patron deity of Tyre. Melkart was not simply Baal under another name. He had his own specific mythology, his own specific rituals, and his own cult. But he was clearly a Baal-type deity, a royal divine figure associated with fertility, the sea, and the sun, who underwent a seasonal death and resurrection in his annual ritual. The most distinctive feature of Melkart's cult was the annual ritual known as the Awakening of Heracles, or the Egersis, the resurrection ceremony in which Melkart, who had died in his seasonal cycle, was ritually awakened or reanimated. This ceremony involved fire and apparently some form of ritual drama reenacting the god's return to life. It was one of the most important religious events in the Phoenician calendar. The name Melkart appears in the biblical record primarily through Jezebel, who was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and a priest of Melkart. Jezebel's missionary zeal for Baal in Israel was specifically zeal for Melkart, the god of her home city. The prophets of Baal who confronted Elijah on Carmel were probably prophets of Melkart. Baal in Phoenician colonies, Carthage and beyond. As the Phoenicians established colonies throughout the Mediterranean, in North Africa, in Spain, in Sicily, in Sardinia, they brought their gods with them. The most important of these colonies was Carthage, founded according to tradition around 814 BCE by refugees from Tyre. Carthage became one of the great powers of the ancient Mediterranean, controlling much of North Africa, southern Spain, and western Sicily until its destruction by Rome in 146 BCE. At Carthage, the Phoenician Baal underwent a transformation and became known as Baal Hammon, Lord of the Incense Altar, or, in some interpretations, Lord of the Amanus, a mountain range. Baal Hammon was the supreme god of Carthage, paired with the goddess Tanit, the Carthaginian equivalent of Asherah, and his worship was the central feature of Carthaginian religious life. The archaeological evidence from Carthage, as I mentioned earlier, includes the famous Tophet, the sacred precinct where urns containing the remains of cremated children and animals were buried. The debate about whether these burials represent child sacrifice or the burial of children who died naturally continues among scholars, but the majority view, based on classical literary sources, inscriptions, and the physical evidence itself, is that Baal Hammon did indeed receive child sacrifice at Carthage. The practice is mentioned by several ancient authors, including Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, who describe the Carthaginians offering children to Baal Hammon in the bronze statue of the god whose outstretched arms would receive the child before dropping it into the fire below. Baal in Egypt. Egypt had its own relationship with Baal that is quite distinct from the Israelite context. From the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550–1070 BCE, onward, Baal was adopted into the Egyptian pantheon as a foreign deity who nonetheless belonged to the divine world. Egyptian texts refer to Baal as the son of Ptah, the Memphite creator god, or of Nut, the sky goddess, and he was identified with the Egyptian storm and chaos god Set, himself a complex deity associated with storms, the desert, and foreign lands. The identification of Baal with Set is historically interesting. Set was the murderer of Osiris in the Egyptian myth, the chaotic adversary who killed the good king and scattered his body. This characterization of Set Baal as a murderous chaos figure aligns in some ways with the biblical characterization of Baal as a false, dangerous deity, but the identification was not always negative in Egyptian thinking. During the Ramesside period, particularly under Ramesses II and his successors, Set Baal was actually celebrated as a war god and royal patron. There are Egyptian texts that praise Baal as the storm warrior that depict his battle with the sea dragon, compare the Ugaritic Baal versus Yam, and that associate him with military prowess and the power of the storm. These texts show us that the mythology of Baal was known in Egypt and integrated into Egyptian religious understanding, even as his worship, in a pure Canaanite form, remained foreign to Egypt. The presence of Baal in Egyptian records from the Ramesside period, the period of the pharaohs traditionally associated with the Exodus, is also of interest for biblical interpretation. The Semitic-speaking population of Egypt, the Asiatic workers and slaves who formed a significant part of the labor force during this period, brought Baal with them. Some scholars have suggested that the religious environment of the Israelites in Egypt before the Exodus would have included significant exposure to Baal worship, which may explain some of the persistent Baal temptations that the Exodus narrative and subsequent history describe. Baal in the wider ancient world, Hadad. Throughout the ancient Near East, the storm god who was known as Baal in Canaan was known as Hadad or Adad in Mesopotamia and Teshub among the Hittites, but these deities shared a family resemblance that makes it appropriate to speak of a wider storm god religious phenomenon: the thunder, the lightning, the life-giving rain. These phenomena inspired similar divine personalities across the cultures of the ancient Near East, and the cross-cultural fertilization between these religious traditions was ongoing and complex. The Aramean kingdoms of Syria, Damascus being the most famous, had a major cult of Hadad, the storm god. The ancient city of Damascus had a great temple to Hadad that was later converted into a temple to the Roman god Jupiter Damasinus, and then, after the Muslim conquest of Syria in the 7th century CE, into the famous Umayyad Mosque, which still stands today. The history of that single site, from Hadad's temple to Jupiter's temple to an Islamic mosque, encapsulates centuries of religious transformation in the ancient Near East. The name Hadad appears in several Aramean royal names, including Ben-Hadad, son of Hadad, the name of several kings of Damascus mentioned in the Bible, for 1 Kings 15:20, 2 Kings 6:8. The personal name Hadad also appears in the Old Testament in several contexts, including as the name of Edomite royalty, 1 Kings 11:14-25. Suggesting the widespread use of the storm god's name as an element of personal and royal identity throughout the ancient Near East. Baal and Yahweh, the theological rivalry. We have been circling around a profound theological question throughout this presentation, and now it is time to address it directly. What was the exact nature of the theological conflict between Baal worship and Yahweh worship? This is not simply a question about which religion won the historical competition. It is a question about what was fundamentally at stake in that competition. What did the choice between Baal and Yahweh actually mean? The nature religion versus history religion debate. One of the most influential frameworks for understanding the Baal versus Yahweh conflict was developed by 20th century biblical scholar G. Ernest Wright and others, who drew a sharp distinction between nature religion and history religion. Baalism, in this view, was a nature religion. It was centered on the cycles of nature, the rhythms of rain and drought, the agricultural calendar, the fertility of the earth. Its myths were cosmic and natural. Baal dies in the summer, resurrects in the autumn. Its rituals were designed to align human activity with natural cycles and to participate in or influence cosmic natural processes. Yahwism, by contrast, was a history religion. It was centered not on the cycles of nature, but on Yahweh's specific, unrepeatable acts in history: the call of Abraham, the exodus from Egypt, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the gift of the land of Canaan. Yahweh was not a God who died and rose again with the seasons. Yahweh was a God who had done specific things at specific times and had entered into a specific covenant relationship with a specific people. The festivals of Yahweh were not celebrations of cosmic natural cycles, but commemorations of historical events. This framework captures something real and important: the distinction between the cyclical natural mythology of Baal and the linear historical theology of Yahwism is genuine and significant. The Exodus story is not a myth of cosmic cycles. It is the story of specific historical divine intervention in the lives of specific historical people. This historical grounding of Yahwism gave it a different character from Baalism, more particular, more relational, more concerned with justice and covenant than with cosmic fertility. However, the sharp nature-history dichotomy has been challenged by more recent scholarship, and rightly so. Yahweh was also a God of the natural world. The Psalms are full of Yahweh's control over weather, sea, harvest, and creation. And Baal worship was not entirely without historical consciousness. The Ugaritic texts show a God with specific relationships, specific enemies, a specific political location in the divine council. The distinction is real, but should not be drawn too absolutely. The justice dimension. One of the most significant aspects of the Yahwistic critique of Baalism was the justice dimension. Yahweh, as understood by the prophets, was a God of justice, righteousness, and ethical concern. His covenant with Israel was not merely a religious arrangement for securing rain and harvest. It was an ethical covenant that demanded just treatment of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. The great prophetic tradition from Amos through Isaiah through Jeremiah is full of the insistence that worship without justice is worthless in Yahweh's eyes. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos 5:21-24. The Baal religion, by contrast, had no obvious social justice dimension. It was a religion of fertility, power, and cosmic force. If the rain fell and the crops grew, Baal was being worshipped properly. There was no divine demand for the protection of the vulnerable, no covenantal requirement of ethical treatment of the poor. The god of the storm did not particularly care how you treated your slaves or your debtors, and this absence of a justice requirement may have been part of Baal's appeal to the wealthy and powerful. A religion that asked for sacrifices at the high place but did not demand justice in the marketplace was a very convenient religion for those with economic power to exploit. Hosea, Amos, Micah, Isaiah, all of the great 8th century prophets connect the Baal problem with the justice problem. The same society that worships Baal is also exploiting the poor, running corrupt courts, using dishonest weights and measures, selling the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. This is not coincidental, in the prophet's view. A society that has abandoned the God of justice for the God of fertility has, by that very theological choice, also abandoned the ethical demands of the covenant. The two failures, religious and moral, are the same failure viewed from different angles. The monotheism question. The Baal crisis was also the crisis in which biblical monotheism crystallized. Scholars debate the development of Israelite monotheism, whether it existed from the beginning of Israelite religion or developed gradually over time. But most scholars today recognize that what we might call practical monotheism or exclusive monolatry, worshiping one God exclusively, whether or not other gods are acknowledged to exist, was the prophetic demand from at least the time of the early prophets, and that what we might call theoretical monotheism, the explicit denial of the existence of any other gods, became fully articulated in the exilic period, particularly in the writings of 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 40:55. The confrontation with Baal was a major catalyst in this development. The stronger and more explicit the Yahwistic claim, Yahweh is God, Baal is nothing, the more Baal worship forced the Yahwists to clarify what exactly they meant. If Baal is not a god, what is he? An idol, a demon, a human projection? 2nd Isaiah's devastating polemics against idols, the passages where he describes a craftsman cutting down a tree, using half for firewood, and carving the other half into a god and worshipping it, are among the most brilliant and pointed monotheistic arguments ever written, and they are written against the backdrop of exactly this kind of Baal and idol worship that had plagued Israel for centuries. The claim that Yahweh is the only real God, not merely the strongest God, not merely Israel's God, but the only actual divine being in existence, is one of the most radical theological claims in human intellectual history. It appears in its fullest form in texts like Isaiah 44:46, where Yahweh explicitly says, "There is no God besides him. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God." This exclusive monotheism was not simply a comfortable religious position. It was a direct, categorical denial of every other divine claim in the ancient world, including the claim of Baal. And the Baal struggle was, in significant part, what forced Yahwistic theology to develop and articulate this position with such precision and force. One of the most fascinating and less commonly discussed dimensions of Baal's significance for the Bible is the way in which Baal's mythology, his titles, his imagery, and his narrative roles have been quietly but deliberately co-opted, reinterpreted, and applied to Yahweh in the Psalms. This is not plagiarism or syncretism, it is polemic, a theological argument carried out through the appropriation and transformation of rival divine imagery. The Psalms are engaging in a conversation with Baal theology, and to hear that conversation clearly, we need to know Baal's side of it. The storm god imagery in the Psalms. Psalm 29 is perhaps the most striking example of this phenomenon. It is a psalm that describes Yahweh's voice, the divine thunder, with extraordinary power and beauty. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. Scholars have long noted the striking parallels between Psalm 29 and the Ugaritic Baal texts. The geographical locations mentioned, Lebanon, Syrian, another name for Mount Hermon, the desert of Kadesh, all correspond to the geographical setting of Baal's domain in the Ugaritic texts. The imagery of the divine voice as thunder, the shaking of the earth, the breaking of cedars, all of these are specifically associated with Baal Hadad, the storm god, in the Ugaritic material. Some scholars have suggested that Psalm 29 may originally have been a Canaanite hymn to Baal that was adapted for Yahwistic worship simply by substituting Yahweh for Baal. Whether or not that specific reconstruction is correct, the theological move is clear and deliberate. The psalm takes the storm imagery and all its cosmic power that the Canaanite religious tradition associated with Baal and ascribes it entirely and exclusively to Yahweh. The God of Israel is the one who thunders over the waters. The God of Israel is the one whose voice breaks the cedars. Baal does not do these things, Yahweh does. The implicit argument: if you are attracted to storm god worship because you see the power of the storm and want to be connected to that power, know that the power behind the storm is not Baal, but Yahweh. The Rider of the Clouds title. We mentioned earlier that Baal's title, Rider of the Clouds, in Ugaritic, RKB-RPT, is one of the most distinctive epithets in the Baal texts. It appears numerous times in the Baal cycle and hymnic literature as a characteristic description of the storm god in his role as the cloud-riding deity who brings the rain. What is theologically striking is that exactly this epithet appears in the Hebrew Bible applied to Yahweh. Psalm 68:4 says, "Sing to God, sing in praise of his name, extol him who rides on the clouds, his name is the Lord, and rejoice before him." The Hebrew word translated clouds here is eravat, but the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, rendered it with a word meaning west or sunset, a translation choice that actually preserved a different nuance. However, in Deuteronomy 33:26, the blessing of Moses, we read, "There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides across the heavens to help you, and on the clouds in his majesty." And in Psalm 18:9-10, parallel to 2 Samuel 22, "He parted the heavens and came down, dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind." The deliberate appropriation of Baal's signature title, Rider of the Clouds, for Yahweh is a stunning piece of polemical theology. It says, in effect, you think you know who rides the clouds? You think Baal is the cloud rider? No. The real rider of the clouds is Yahweh. Every time the storm rolls in, every time you look up at the thunderclouds and feel the awesome power of the storm approaching, you are looking at Yahweh, not Baal. Baal is an impersonator. He has stolen a title that belongs to the one who actually rides the storm. Psalm 93 and the Sea Combat Myth. Psalm 93 is another psalm that engages directly with the Baal mythology from Ugaritic. The Lord reigns, he is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armed with strength. The seas have lifted up, Lord. The seas have lifted up their voice. The seas have lifted up their pounding waves. Mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. The lifting up of the seas, the pounding waves, the Lord's victory over the waters. This is the Baal combat myth applied to Yahweh. In the Ugaritic version, Baal defeats Yam, the sea chaos, and establishes his kingship. In Psalm 93, it is Yahweh who is mightier than the seas, Yahweh who reigns as king, Yahweh whose throne is established from of old. The psalm is not borrowing Canaanite myth, it is claiming the myth's underlying reality for Yahweh, asserting that the cosmic battle against chaos and the establishment of divine kingship that Canaanites attributed to Baal is actually Yahweh's story. Psalm 74, Psalm 89, Isaiah 27, Isaiah 51, and the Book of Job all contain references to the battle against the sea monster, Leviathan, Rahab, the dragon, the fleeing serpent, that directly echo the Ugaritic descriptions of the battles of Baal and El against Yam and Lotan. In each case, these battles and the power that overcomes the sea monster are attributed to Yahweh. The entire cosmological drama of ancient Canaanite mythology, the battles, the kingship, the control of storm and sea, is reclaimed for the God of Israel. This systematic appropriation of Baal's mythology for Yahweh is one of the most important and underappreciated aspects of the Old Testament's engagement with Canaanite religion. The prophets condemned Baal in direct polemical terms. The psalmists did something subtler but equally powerful. They took the most compelling, most beautiful, most awe-inspiring aspects of Baal's divine persona and relocated them in Yahweh. You want a storm god? Here is the real storm god. You want a cosmic king who defeats chaos? Here is the one who actually defeated chaos. You want a deity who rides the clouds and speaks in thunder? Here he is, and his name is Yahweh. Baal in the prophetic vision of restoration. The prophets who condemned Baal so vehemently also articulated a vision of what Israel's life would look like when the Baal problem was resolved, when the people finally, fully, exclusively turned to Yahweh. These visions of restoration are as important as the condemnations because they give us the positive theological vision that the anti-Baal polemic was serving. Hosea's vision, new betrothal. Hosea, as we have seen, used the marriage metaphor most extensively. His vision of restoration in chapters 2 and 14 is among the most tenderly beautiful passages in all prophetic literature. After describing Israel's faithlessness with the Baals in the most painful terms, the wife who goes after her lovers, the nation that forgets its God, Hosea describes what Yahweh will do. Therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. And then the remarkable promise, "In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my Baal." The word Baal, Lord, Master, will be removed from Israel's lips, even as a generic title, even as an honorific. The word Baal will be abandoned in favor of the more intimate Ish, my man, my husband, suggesting genuine love rather than mere ownership. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. Hosea 2:18 then extends the vision. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. A new Edenic peace, a covenant that extends to all creation. This is the positive vision that anti-Baal theology was serving. Not just the elimination of a bad religion, but the restoration of a beautiful original relationship between humanity, the natural world, and God. Hosea 14 ends with a remarkable agricultural promise, the very things that Baal supposedly provided, but actually could not. I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily. Like a cedar of Lebanon, he will send down his roots. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree, his fragrance like a cedar of Lebanon. People will dwell again in his shade. They will flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. The imagery here is deliberately and pointedly agricultural. Dew, blossoming, roots, fragrance, grain, wine. These are exactly the things that Baal's worshippers sought from him. The fertility of the land, the abundance of agricultural life. Hosea's vision is that all of these things will come from Yahweh, not from Baal, when Israel finally turns back to its true God. Jeremiah's New Covenant. Jeremiah's vision of restoration, perhaps the most theologically significant passage in all of his prophecy, also responds directly to the Baal problem. In chapters 30-33, often called the Book of Consolation, Jeremiah articulates a vision of future restoration that includes a new covenant that directly addresses the failure of the old covenant in the face of Baal worship. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Jeremiah 31:33-34. The Old Covenant had been repeatedly broken by Baal worship. The law had been given, engraved on stone, written in scrolls, and Israel had ignored it, violated it, forgotten it in favor of the Baals. The New Covenant Jeremiah envisions is one in which the law is internalized, written not on stone but on hearts, not external law but internal disposition. This is a direct response to the Baal failure. The external religious system, the temple, the festivals, the priesthood, had coexisted with Baal worship for centuries. What was needed was not better external religion, but a transformation of the heart. Ezekiel and the spiritual heart transplant. Ezekiel, who prophesied to the exiles in Babylon, articulates a similar vision in even more radical terms. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Ezekiel 11:19-20. And the even more famous passage in Ezekiel 36, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. and I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. The heart of stone that needs to be replaced with a heart of flesh is, in context, the heart that has repeatedly turned to Baal. The new spirit is the divine presence that will finally solve the idolatry problem from the inside rather than through external pressure. All of these prophetic visions of restoration are, at their core, responses to the Baal crisis. They envision a future in which the Baal problem is solved, not through better education or stronger laws or more powerful military enforcement, but through a transformation of human nature itself. Baal, in Jewish literature, the post-biblical tradition. After the Babylonian exile, 586-539 BCE, and the subsequent return and reconstruction of the Jerusalem community, Baal worship ceased to be an active, living challenge to Israelite Jewish religion. The experience of exile, understood by the community as the direct consequence of the Baal worship described by the pre-exilic prophets, had a profound and apparently permanent effect on Jewish religious consciousness. Post-exilic Judaism was, almost without exception, monotheistic in the full theoretical sense. There is one God, and He alone is to be worshipped. The age of the Baals was over. But Baal did not simply disappear from Jewish consciousness. He was preserved in several significant ways in post-biblical Jewish literature, and his legacy shaped Jewish demonology, apocalyptic theology, and biblical interpretation in important ways. Baal in Second Temple Apocalyptic. The period between the end of the Old Testament canon, roughly 5th century BCE, and the beginning of the New Testament, 1st century CE, is known as the Second Temple period, and it was extraordinarily productive in terms of religious literature. Much of this literature, including texts like Enoch, Jubilees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and various other texts that were not included in either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, but that were widely read, continued to grapple with the problem of false gods and demonic powers. In this literature, the foreign gods of the nations, including Baal and his relatives, were increasingly understood as demons, evil spiritual powers, fallen angels, or cosmic adversaries. The Book of Jubilees, for example, understands the gods of the nations as the spirits of the Nephilim, the giants produced by the illicit union of angels and human women in Genesis 6. The Book of 1st Enoch develops an elaborate mythology of fallen angels who corrupted humanity with forbidden knowledge and false religion, a mythology that provided a framework for understanding where the Baals and other divine beings of the nations came from. They were fallen divine beings, real but evil, exercising a corrupting influence on humanity. This theological move from "the gods of the nations are nothing, worthless idols," the standard prophetic line, to "the gods of the nations are real but demonic," the apocalyptic development, had enormous consequences. It provided a way of explaining why Baal worship was so persistent and so difficult to eradicate. If Baal was not simply a human fantasy, but an actual malevolent spiritual power, then the attraction of Baal worship was the attraction of genuine supernatural agency, however corrupted and evil. This framework, the demonic reality of the false gods, became important in both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Baal in Rabbinic literature. The Rabbinic literature of the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods, roughly 100–600 CE, continued to use Baal as a paradigmatic example of idolatry. The rabbis discussed the Baal episodes of the Hebrew Bible extensively: the Baal Peor incident, the contest on Mount Carmel, the Baal worship of the kings, as case studies in the fundamental prohibition of idolatry, avodah zarah, literally foreign worship, that they understood to be one of the three cardinal sins that could never be violated even under threat of death. The rabbis were particularly interested in the psychology of Baal worship. Why had Israel repeatedly fallen into this sin despite divine warnings and divine punishment? Their answer was that there had been a powerful supernatural evil inclination, Yetzer Hara, toward idolatry that was only eliminated in the early Second Temple period through divine intervention. A famous Talmudic legend describes the men of the Great Assembly, the religious leadership of the early Second Temple period, successfully capturing and caging the evil inclination toward idolatry, effectively removing the supernatural draw toward false worship from the world. This legend explains why Jews no longer worship Baal. The supernatural force that made idolatry attractive has been neutralized. But it also explains the persistence of Baal worship in the pre-exilic period. It was not simply human weakness, but supernatural compulsion. Baal in the New Testament, Beelzebub and beyond. The New Testament engages with the Baal tradition primarily through the figure of Beelzebub, or Beelzebul, who appears as an important name in the context of Jesus' ministry and the theological confrontation between the kingdom of God and the powers of evil. Beelzebub in the Gospels. The name Beelzebub Beelzebul appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the context of a controversy over Jesus' exorcisms. Jesus has been casting out demons, and some observers, the text identifies them as Pharisees in Matthew, scribes from Jerusalem in Mark, accuse him of casting out demons by Beelzebub, the prince of demons. Matthew 12:24. The accusation is serious. They are claiming that Jesus' power over evil spirits comes not from God, but from the chief of evil spirits himself. Jesus is colluding with Satan. Jesus' response is masterful in its logical force. He asks, "If I drive out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your people drive them out?" And then the devastating argument, if Satan drives out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then can his kingdom stand? Matthew 12:26. If the prince of demons is helping Jesus cast out demons, then the kingdom of evil is eating itself, which makes no sense. Therefore, Jesus argues his exorcisms must be accomplished by the Spirit of God, and this is evidence that the kingdom of God has arrived. The identification of Beelzebub Beelzebul as the prince of demons in the Gospels, the ruler over all evil spiritual beings, represents the full trajectory of Baal's transformation from Canaanite storm god to apocalyptic adversary. The Baal, who was the divine champion against chaos in the Ugaritic myths, has become, in the New Testament's cosmic map, the prince of the very chaos he was supposed to be defeating. This is theologically ironic in a profound way. Baal, who fought against Yam, chaos, and Mot, death, has in the biblical tradition become associated with exactly those forces of chaos and death. The specific accusation that Jesus casts out demons by Beelzebub also echoes the deeper pattern of the Baal confrontation throughout the Old Testament. The question of divine power, the challenge to identify the true source of supernatural activity, the contest between competing claims of divine authority. Just as Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to demonstrate who truly controlled fire from heaven, Jesus is facing a challenge to identify the true source of his power over evil. In both cases, the answer is the same. Not Baal, not Beelzebub, but Yahweh, the one who truly rules over all. The beast and Babylon, Baal imagery in Revelation. The Book of Revelation, written at the end of the 1st century CE, draws extensively on Old Testament prophetic imagery, including imagery associated with Baal worship, to describe the cosmic conflict between God and evil in the final age. Several of the book's most vivid images have roots in the Baal mythology that we have been tracing. The beast from the sea, in Revelation 13, the great apocalyptic monster that rises from the chaotic waters, directly echoes both the Ugaritic Yam, sea, and the sea monster, Lotan, Leviathan. The 7 heads of the beast echo the 7 heads of Lotan in the Ugaritic texts. The beast's apparent death and resurrection, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed, echoes the death and resurrection mythology of Baal. The entire symbolic complex of sea monster plus death and resurrection that structures so much of Revelation's imagery has its roots in the Canaanite mythology of Baal and his cosmic enemies. Babylon the great harlot of Revelation 17-18, is described in terms that echo the prophetic condemnations of Baal-worshipping cities and nations, idolatry, sexual immorality, intoxicating the nations with her wine, shedding the blood of God's servants. The merchants who committed adultery with her and the kings who gave themselves up to luxury recall the prophet's descriptions of the Baal-worshipping nations and their economic and political entanglements with false religion. Revelation is drawing on centuries of prophetic anti-Baal polemic to construct its image of the ultimate anti-God power in human history. The final defeat of the beast and the false prophet in Revelation 19, thrown alive into the lake of fire, echoes Anat's destruction of Mot in the Ugaritic Baal cycle, the grinding with millstones, the burning with fire, and the New Jerusalem that descends in Revelation 21, the beautiful, ordered, divine city with its river of life and tree of life, is the ultimate realization of what Baal's mythology promised but could not deliver, a world of abundance, life, order, and beauty, governed not by the storm god of a limited mythology, but by the eternal God who truly creates, truly sustains, and truly renews. Baal in medieval demonology. After the New Testament period, Baal did not simply fade from memory. He continued to appear in the religious imagination of subsequent centuries, particularly in the demonological traditions that developed within Christianity and later in Jewish mysticism. These developments are fascinating, not simply as historical curiosities, but as evidence of the remarkable persistence and cultural power of the original Canaanite deity. Baal in early Christian writing. The early church fathers, writing from the 2nd through the 5th centuries CE, had various things to say about Baal and his relatives. Most followed the trajectory established in Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament. The gods of the nations, including Baal, were real beings, fallen angels or demons, who had led humanity astray and who were now being defeated by the power of Christ. Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, and others all adopted variations of this demonic reality view of pagan deities. The specific identification of Beelzebub Baal as a chief demon was further developed in patristic literature. Origen, for example, discussed Beelzebub as one of the highest-ranking evil powers, connected to the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places mentioned in Ephesians 6. The hierarchical organization of demonic powers that appears in later medieval demonology has its origins in this patristic development, which in turn has its roots in the New Testament identification of Beelzebub as the prince of demons. The medieval demonological tradition. In medieval Christianity, elaborate catalogs of demons were produced, organizing the demonic world into a hierarchical system modeled on the heavenly hierarchy of angels. In these catalogs, Baal or Baal appears as one of the major demonic kings, often listed among the highest-ranking powers of the infernal realm. The grimoire tradition, the books of magical instruction that circulated in medieval and early modern Europe, included Baal or Baal as a demon of considerable power and specific magical qualities. The famous grimoire, the Ars Goetia, the first section of the larger work known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, lists 72 demons in hierarchical order. The first and highest ranking of these is Baal, described as a king who commands 66 legions of spirits, who appears in multiple forms, a man, a cat, a toad, or a combination of these, and who grants the power of invisibility to those who summon him. The placement of Baal at the very top of the demonic hierarchy, the most powerful of the 72 demonic kings, is clearly a reflection of Baal's supreme status in the ancient Canaanite pantheon, distorted through centuries of theological transformation, but still preserving the original hierarchy. The association of Baal with the power of invisibility is interesting and somewhat unexpected. It suggests that whatever original magical or ritual attributes the deity possessed, some echo of them persisted in the distorted form of medieval demonology. The ability to make people invisible might be understood as a distorted memory of the storm god's ability to hide in the clouds, to be present but unseen, powerful but invisible. Other manifestations of Baal appear in various medieval demonological works. Baalberith, combining Baal with the Hebrew Berith, covenant, echoing the biblical Baal-berith of Shechem. Baal-zephon, the biblical Baal-zephon associated with Zaphon, Baal's sacred mountain, and various other compound names. The medieval demonologists, whether or not they fully understood the historical origins of these names, were preserving, in grotesquely distorted form, a catalog of the Canaanite divine world that had been condemned in the Hebrew Bible. Baal in Jewish mysticism. The Jewish mystical tradition, particularly the Kabbalistic literature that developed from the 13th century onward, and including the earlier Hekalat literature of the Talmudic period, also engaged with the demonic world in ways that sometimes preserved traces of the ancient Baal tradition. The concept of the Sitra Achra, the other side in Aramaic, the demonic realm that mirrors and opposes the divine world, provided a theological framework within which the ancient Canaanite gods could be located as cosmic adversaries rather than simply dismissed as human fantasies. The Zohar, the central text of medieval Kabbalah, refers to various demonic powers with names and characteristics that echo the ancient mythological world, including forces associated with storm, sea, and death that recall the divine adversaries of the Baal cycle. While direct connections are difficult to establish with certainty, the persistence of these mythological patterns in Jewish mystical literature suggests that the ancient religious traditions of the Canaanite world left more lasting marks on the broader Jewish imagination than the official prophetic tradition of absolute rejection might suggest. Baal in modern scholarship, new discoveries, and ongoing debates. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen enormous advances in our understanding of Baal and the religious world he inhabited. New discoveries, new methodologies, and new theoretical frameworks have transformed the field of Canaanite religious studies and have forced ongoing revisions in how we read the biblical text in light of its ancient Near Eastern context. The ongoing Ugaritic revolution. The discovery of the Ugaritic texts in 1929 was only the beginning. Excavations at Ras Shamra continued through the 20th century, and the corpus of Ugaritic texts has been continuously expanding as new tablets are discovered, damaged tablets are re-examined with new technology, and scholarly understanding of the Ugaritic language deepens. The publication of new critical editions of the Ugaritic texts, notably Manfred Dietrich, Oswald Loretz, and Joaquin San Martin's monumental Die Keil-alphabetischen Texte aus Ugarit, has made the material more accessible to scholars worldwide, and the resulting wave of scholarship has transformed our understanding of the Baal cycle and related literature. New imaging technologies, including multispectral imaging that can reveal text on damaged or discolored tablets, have made it possible to read portions of the Ugaritic texts that were previously illegible. Computational analysis of the language has improved our understanding of Ugaritic grammar and vocabulary, and the broader context of ancient Near Eastern literature, art, and archaeology has provided new frameworks for interpreting the Baal texts. One of the most significant ongoing debates in Ugaritic scholarship concerns the genre and function of the Baal cycle. Was it primarily a liturgical text, recited or performed as part of specific rituals? Was it a royal epic celebrating the divine patron of the Ugaritic monarchy? Was it a wisdom text, a meditation on the nature of life, death, and cosmic order? Or was it a combination of all these things? A multifunctional sacred text that could be deployed in various contexts? The answer to this question matters for how we understand the relationship between the mythology of Baal and the ritual practice of Baal worship. The Israelite origins debate. One of the most contentious and important debates in contemporary biblical scholarship concerns the religious origins of Israel, specifically how monotheistic Yahwism emerged from the polytheistic religious environment of Canaan. The traditional view that Yahwism was revealed to Moses and the wilderness generation, and that subsequent Baal worship represented a deviation from the original monotheistic norm, has been challenged by the evolutionary or developmental monotheism model, which argues that early Israelite religion was polytheistic, or at least henotheistic, and that full theoretical monotheism developed only gradually, reaching its definitive articulation in the exilic period. The evidence from inscriptions like Kuntilat Adrud, Yahweh and his Asherah, from the widespread distribution of female figurines in Israelite domestic contexts, from the bull figurines and other cultic objects found at Israelite sites, and from the language of some early biblical poetry, has been used to argue that ancient Israelite popular religion was much more similar to Canaanite religion than the canonical biblical text, which represents the perspective of the prophetic reform movement, admits. This debate is not merely academic. It has profound implications for how we understand the nature and authority of the biblical text, the development of monotheism as a world historical phenomenon, and the relationship between the official religion of ancient Israel, as represented by the prophets and the Deuteronomistic tradition, and the popular religion of ordinary Israelites. The most honest answer is that the picture is complex. There is clear evidence of widespread polytheistic and syncretic practice in ancient Israel. The prophets themselves provide the most vivid evidence of this in their passionate and repeated condemnations of what their contemporaries were actually doing. At the same time, there is clear evidence of a prophetic Yahwistic tradition that was genuinely and consistently monotheistic, or at least exclusively monolatrous, from at least the 9th century onward. The biblical canon preserves primarily the perspective of this prophetic tradition, which means that we are reading ancient Israelite religious history through a specific theological lens. What we can say with confidence is this: the struggle against Baal that the Bible describes was real. The attraction of Baal worship was real. The prophets who condemned it were responding to a genuine and widespread religious phenomenon in ancient Israelite society, and the theological development that resulted from this struggle, the crystallization of biblical monotheism, the articulation of a God who acts in history and demands justice, the vision of a new covenant written on the heart, was a response to and a development beyond the Baal crisis that is one of the most significant moments in the entire history of human religious thought. Baal in modern culture, surprising survivals. While we might expect Baal to be thoroughly confined to the ancient past, his presence in modern culture is more extensive than most people realize. His name, his imagery, and elements of his mythology have persisted in Western culture in various forms, some obvious and some quite subtle. Literary and artistic references. The figure of Baal or Beelzebub appears extensively in Western literature, particularly in works dealing with themes of evil, temptation, and the demonic. John Milton's Paradise Lost, one of the greatest works of English literature, includes Baalim and Ashtaroth among the fallen angels who once had shrines in the Holy Land. And when night darkens the streets, then wander forth the sons of Belial, flown with insolence and wine. Milton's characterization of Beelzebub as Satan's second in command, than whom Satan except none higher sat, draws on the identification of Beelzebub as the Prince of Demons from Matthew 12. William Blake, Gustave Flaubert, Alexandre Dumas, and many other literary figures have used Baal or Beelzebub as a figure for extreme evil or demonic power. In the 20th century, Bertolt Brecht wrote a play called Baal, 1918, in which Baal is a name for a morally unrestrained, sexually voracious, and ultimately destructive human figure. Not a supernatural being, but a kind of human archetype of amoral vitality. C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, 1942, features a demonic hierarchy that draws on the medieval demonological tradition in which Baal Beelzebub figures prominently, though Lewis does not use the name directly. William Golding's Lord of the Flies, 1954, has a title that directly translates Baal-Zebub, Lord of the Flies, and the novel's exploration of the dark, irrational, violent impulses lurking beneath civilization is a 20th century literary engagement with the idea of what Baal represented: the forces that pull human society away from ordered, humane community toward violence, cruelty, and the worship of power. Music and popular culture. The name Baal and Beelzebub appear in numerous songs, particularly in the heavy metal and rock music that has drawn extensively on biblical, occult, and mythological imagery since the 1970s. Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody famously includes the line, "Beelzebub has a devil put aside for me." Various metal bands have used the name Baal or imagery associated with Baal worship in their artistic self-presentation. More broadly, the theme of the storm god, the powerful, ambiguous, life-giving, and dangerous divine force associated with the storm, has been a persistent theme in mythology, fantasy literature, and popular storytelling. Thor in Norse mythology, Zeus in Greek mythology, Jupiter in Roman mythology, Indra in Hindu mythology, Teshub in Hittite mythology. All of these storm gods share fundamental characteristics with Baal-Hadad, and all of them have found their way into modern popular culture through various media. When Marvel Comics created a cinematic universe in which Thor is a superhero who controls thunder and lightning, they were drawing on a mythological tradition that includes Baal as a central figure, the spirit of Baal in modern Christian discourse. In contemporary Christian discourse, particularly in charismatic, Pentecostal, and broadly evangelical circles, the figure of Baal has experienced something of a revival as a category for understanding modern cultural and spiritual phenomena. The phrase, "spirit of Baal," is used by some Christian teachers and writers to describe what they see as the persistence of Baal's characteristics: sexual immorality, the subordination of human beings to power structures, the abandonment of justice for the poor, the worship of money and success, and the specific sin of child sacrifice understood in modern terms as abortion in contemporary society and culture. This contemporary use of the Baal category to analyze modern society is hermeneutically interesting. It represents a way of reading the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible as directly applicable to contemporary cultural analysis. The ancient diagnosis that the prophets made of Israel's spiritual condition is seen as equally valid for diagnosing the spiritual condition of modern Western society. Whether or not one agrees with this specific application, it demonstrates the enduring power of the biblical Baal narrative as a framework for understanding the perennial human temptations toward false worship, the subordination of ethics to economic and political power, and the abandonment of covenant fidelity. Theological synthesis: what Baal teaches us about God. We have journeyed a long way through Ugaritic mythology, Israelite history, prophetic polemic, New Testament engagement, medieval demonology, and modern culture. It is time to step back and ask, what does the Baal story, taken in its entirety, teach us about God, about human nature, and about the nature of true worship? What Baal reveals about the human religious impulse. The first thing the Baal story teaches us is something profound about human religious psychology. Baal was not appealing because he was obviously evil. He was appealing because he offered something real and important, a connection between the human and the divine through the most immediately powerful natural phenomena: the storm, the rain, the thunder, and a framework for agricultural life that promised fertility, abundance, and the satisfaction of the most fundamental human needs. The worship of Baal was not, from the perspective of those who practiced it, the worship of evil. It was the attempt to connect with divine power in the most direct, most experiential, most immediately relevant way possible. If you are a farmer in ancient Canaan and you look at the thunderstorm rolling in over the Mediterranean, and you feel the wind, and you smell the rain, and you watch the lightning, the impulse to fall to your knees before that power is completely natural and, in a sense, not wrong. The storm is powerful. The storm is awe-inspiring. The storm is life-giving. The impulse to worship the divine power behind the storm is the religious impulse at its most basic and authentic. What Baal worship got wrong was not the impulse, but the identification, attributing the power behind the storm to a limited, dying and rising, mythology-bound deity rather than to the infinite, eternal, historically active, ethically demanding God who actually created the storm. The prophets never denied that the storm was awe-inspiring. They insisted that the correct response to the awesome power of the storm was the worship of Yahweh, not Baal, because Yahweh was the actual source of that power. This has an enduring lesson for all forms of religious practice. The religious impulse is not in itself a problem. The problem is the misdirection of that impulse. The desire for transcendence, the desire to be connected to a power greater than ourselves, the desire to participate in something larger than our individual lives. These desires are not pathological. They are constitutive of what it means to be human. The question is always, toward what does this desire point? What is its true object? What Baal reveals about false religion. The second great lesson of the Baal story is about the structure of false religion, what makes a religious system false, and what the consequences of false religion are. The prophet's critique of Baalism was not simply that it was theologically incorrect. It was that it was humanly destructive. Consider the features of Baal worship that the prophets condemned: Child sacrifice, the most devastating possible consequence of a theology that treats human beings as instrumental to divine satisfaction rather than as inherently precious to a God who created them in his own image. Sexual exploitation under the guise of sacred ritual, the use of religious sanction to justify the reduction of human beings, particularly women and children, to instruments of cultic fertility practice. The absence of justice demands a religion that asks for sacrifices at the altar but makes no demands about how you treat the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. The collusion between religious and political power, the prophets of Baal at Jezebel's court, funded by royal wealth, serving to sanctify a political order that exploited the poor and killed the righteous. The false promise of fertility, claiming credit for what nature produces, and demanding worship on the basis of divine gifts that were actually provided by someone else. Each of these features of Baal worship has its counterpart in what the prophets understood as the distortions of authentic Yahwism, and indeed in distortions of authentic religion in any tradition, in any age. A religion that demands ultimate human sacrifice in any form, whether literal or metaphorical, that uses sacred sanction to cover exploitation, that makes no justice demands, that serves to bless existing power arrangements, that promises what it cannot deliver. Such a religion, in any of its forms, is in the prophet's category of Baal worship, regardless of the name by which it calls its deity. What Baal reveals about the nature of Yahweh. The third great lesson is perhaps the most profound. The Baal story tells us a great deal about what the biblical God, Yahweh, is not, and therefore, by contrast, what Yahweh is. Yahweh is not a dying and rising God. He is not caught up in the natural cycle of death and resurrection. He does not descend into Mot's realm and need Anat to rescue him. He does not depend on human ritual to be restored. The God of the Bible is not subject to death. He is the living God, the one who is, who was, and who is to come. The specific features of the Baal cycle, the divine death, the divine vulnerability, the need for divine rescue, are absent from the God of Israel's portraiture. Yahweh does not die. He is not overcome by his adversaries. His adversaries are overcome by him. Yahweh is not primarily a nature god. He acts in nature, to be sure. He controls the storm, the rain, the harvest. But his primary self-disclosure is not through the annual rhythm of the agricultural year, but through specific, unrepeatable historical events. The creation of the world, the call of Abraham, the Exodus, the covenant at Sinai, the gift of the promised land. He is a God with a biography, a God who has done specific things in the real world for specific people at specific times. This historical specificity gives Yahwism a different character from nature religion. It is not about aligning with universal cosmic cycles, but about responding to a God who has acted and will act again in the real world of human history. Yahweh demands justice. He is not indifferent to how his worshippers treat one another. The covenant he makes with Israel is an ethical covenant. It includes not only religious duties, worship at the right place, in the right way, with the right rituals, but ethical duties, care for the poor, justice in the courts, honesty in commerce, protection of the vulnerable. The character of Yahweh, as described by the prophets, is inseparable from his demand for justice. A Yahweh who was comfortable with child sacrifice, who did not care about the exploitation of the poor, who had no ethical requirements of his worshippers. Such a deity would not be Yahweh. He would be Baal. Yahweh is faithful. This is perhaps the deepest difference between Yahweh and Baal. Baal's relationship with his worshippers was fundamentally transactional. You give him sacrifice, he gives you rain. If the sacrifice was insufficient or incorrect, the rain might not come. The worshipper's relationship with Baal was a business arrangement, contingent on proper performance. Yahweh's relationship with Israel, as the prophets consistently insist, is a covenant relationship, characterized by hesed, the Hebrew word for covenant faithfulness, steadfast love, mercy. Yahweh does not abandon Israel when Israel fails to perform properly. He chastises, he pleads, he warns, he waits. But his fundamental commitment to Israel does not depend on Israel's performance. Hosea's God keeps loving his unfaithful wife. Jeremiah's God plans to restore what was destroyed. Ezekiel's God plans a spiritual heart transplant that will finally enable his people to love him back. This faithfulness, this persistence of divine love in the face of human failure, is precisely what distinguishes Yahweh from Baal. and what makes the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis to Revelation, ultimately a love story rather than a contractual arrangement. Conclusion: the enduring contest. We began this journey on a mountaintop in ancient Canaan, with Elijah standing alone against the prophets of Baal. We ended here in the 21st century, having traveled through mythology, archaeology, prophecy, demonology, and cultural history. The question we must ask as we come down from our own mountaintop is this: was the contest on Carmel a one-time event, now safely confined to history, or is it still going on? The honest answer, I think, is that it has never stopped. Baal's genius, if we can call it that, was never his mythology. The mythology was a container, not the content. The content was something far more durable, the promise that you can have the divine without ethical demand, that you can secure the blessings of the transcendent world without being transformed by them, that worship and justice can be separated, that you can burn something on an altar and go home unchanged. That promise did not die with the Phoenicians. It does not require a bronze statue or a sacred pole to function. It only requires the human heart, which has always been drawn to the idea of a God who asks for performance rather than personhood, who wants your sacrifice rather than your soul, who will bless you without bothering you. The prophets of Israel, those lonely, difficult, frequently unwelcome figures, saw this clearly. They understood that the battle against Baal was not ultimately a battle against a foreign religion. It was a battle against a way of being human, the way that uses the language of the sacred to avoid the demands of the sacred, that builds temples and forgets the poor outside them, that invokes the divine name and ignores the divine character. What they held out in opposition was not simply a different theology, but a different vision of what the relationship between humanity and the divine could be: intimate, ethical, transformative, and finally, this is the word Hosea reached for, the word the later prophets kept returning to: faithful, a God who would not let go, a God whose love was not contingent on performance, a God who, when his people walked away, kept calling after them, "Return to me, and I will return to you." That is the vision, the ancient, radical, still unrealized vision that the long struggle with Baal produced and refined. Not the elimination of the religious impulse, but its purification. Not the end of awe before the storm, but the recognition that the storm is not God, it is the voice of God. Not the abandonment of sacrifice, but the transformation of sacrifice into something that costs the offerer something real: justice, mercy, humility. The fire fell on Carmel. The prophets of Baal were silenced, and then, as the great story of the Bible knows, and as Elijah himself discovered in the cave at Horeb, the work continued. It always continues, because Baal is not fundamentally an ancient Canaanite deity. Baal is a permanent possibility of the human heart, the possibility of a God shaped to our desires rather than a God who shapes our desires. The question Elijah put to the people on that mountaintop remains on the table. It is still being put to us, in every generation, in every culture, in every human heart that faces the choice between the comfortable and the true. How long will you waver between two opinions? The fire falls, the rain comes, the question stands. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.